Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different, because tonight we're not just visiting the Victorians, we're visiting the Victorians who have taken something. Quite a lot of something. Usually you've heard about their fog, their workhouses, their unfortunate relationship with soap. Tonight we're talking about what an ordinary Victorian person kept in the medicine cabinet, and why that medicine cabinet could technically get an elephant sedated. Before we get into it, if you're the kind of person who enjoys drifting off to the sound of a stranger describing 19th century opium habits, do me a favour and hit like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this. I'm not going to pretend that's not a transaction. And drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. I read every single one, and it's genuinely my favourite part of doing this. Now go ahead and dim the lights. Get a fan going for that soft background hum. Get yourself tucked in exactly the way you like, because we're going to be here a while. Before we drop you into it, let's warm up with a few questions, the kind you have never once needed answered until right now. Ever wondered why your average Victorian baby was somehow both constantly crying and permanently sedated? Ever wondered how a nation of people who fainted at the sight of a bare ankle also handed out morphine over the counter like it was a boiled sweet? Ever wondered what a respectable vicar's wife kept in her purse next to her hymn book, and whether it would get her arrested today? Ever wondered why the most productive era of the British Empire ran on a population that was, for a meaningful portion of any given afternoon, extremely high? We are going to answer every single one of these tonight, slowly, gently, and with the full weight of historical accuracy, even when the truth sounds like something I invented to keep you awake, which, ironically, is the opposite of my job here. Congratulations, you've just woken up in Victorian Britain, and before your feet have even found the cold floorboards, there is a very real chance you already have a controlled substance in your bloodstream, administered lovingly by a family member who had absolutely no idea that's what it was. The first sound in a Victorian household most mornings was not a rooster, and it was not a kettle. It was the soft clink of a brown glass bottle being set back down on a nightstand. You reach for it the way a modern person reaches for a phone, half asleep, entirely by muscle memory. And inside is a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol that a chemist sold you last Tuesday with roughly the same ceremony as a bag of flour. What you are holding has a name, laudanum, and a recipe that has barely changed since a physician called Thomas Sydenham wrote it down 2 centuries earlier. Raw opium is steeped in sherry or brandy until it dissolves. And then, because even the 17th century understood that straight opium spirit tastes like punishment, someone adds saffron for colour, a little cinnamon, a clove or two, sometimes nutmeg. The result is a reddish-brown liquid that smells faintly of a spice cupboard someone forgot to close. Sweetish, warm, medicinal in that specific way that makes your nose wrinkle and your shoulders relax at the same time. It is in effect mulled wine designed by a chemistry set. Not all laudanum was the same laudanum, and a household with any pretensions to particularity had opinions on the matter. Sydenham's original formula, sherry-based, richly spiced, remained the classic, but by the time you are standing at your nightstand, a rival preparation called Batley's sedative solution has muscled onto the shelves. Made without the acidic vinegar sometimes added to older recipes and marketed as gentler on a delicate stomach, which in practice meant it was, confusingly, often stronger in its actual opium content than the bottle it was replacing. There was also Dover's powder, opium blended with ipecacuanha for sweating out fevers, and something called black drop, a vinegar-based preparation favoured by those who found the standard tincture unbearably sweet. Choosing between them was a little like choosing a coffee order today, a matter of personal ritual and mild brand loyalty, except that getting the order wrong could, in sufficient quantity, be fatal in a way that an oversized latte generally is not. The taste is bitter underneath the sweetness, syrupy on the tongue, with a burn at the back of the throat that tells you the alcohol content is doing real work alongside the opium. Nobody measures it in milligrams. You measure it in drops, counted out with a spoon or a little glass dropper. 25 drops for a headache, more for a toothache, more still if the toothache has feelings about it. There is no pharmacist standing between you and the dosage, no printed warning label, no small paragraph about drowsiness. There is a bottle, a spoon, and your own private arithmetic, refined over years, the way a person today refines exactly how much caffeine gets them through a Monday without gets them fired. And the price is almost insulting in its cheapness. A penny, sometimes less, bought enough laudanum to knock out a household of insomniacs, which made it, pound for pound, considerably more affordable than gin, and gin was already the discount option of the era. You could buy it at the chemist shop, yes, but also at the general grocer, at the ironmonger, from the man who also sold you candles and boot polish, at country fairs alongside gingerbread and ribbon. It required no license to purchase and no explanation to offer. You wanted it, you paid for it, you left with it tucked into your coat pocket next to the tea and the tobacco. 3 equally unremarkable errands accomplished in a single afternoon. The morning ritual is where the true domestic strangeness of it lives. A servant girl takes a spoonful before her shift because her back aches and there are 4 flights of stairs waiting for her. A lawyer takes a few drops in his tea because his nerves feel unsteady before court, the exact same phrase a person today might use before a presentation, minus the opium. A retired colonel takes his dose because his gout has opinions about the weather, and his wife takes hers because she has opinions about the colonel. Nobody in this arrangement considers themselves to be doing a drug. They consider themselves to be maintaining their health in the same unbothered spirit that a modern person swallows a vitamin gummy shaped like a bear and calls it wellness. The dosing occasions multiplied to fill whatever the day required. A young bride took a few drops the night before her wedding to steady nerves that nobody expected her to name aloud. A touring actor took a dose before curtain to smooth the tremor out of a monologue, the green room equivalent of a modern performer doing breathing exercises in the wings. A ship's captain kept a bottle in his cabin for the crossing, doled out to seasick passengers with the same unbothered generosity a modern flight attendant shows toward a bag of pretzels. Even the clergy were not exempt. A vicar might take a spoonful before a long funeral sermon delivered in an unheated stone church in February, which, on reflection, sounds like one of the more understandable uses of the entire century. What makes it properly bizarre from where you are standing now is the sheer democratic reach of the stuff. This was not an indulgence reserved for the idle rich lounging on velvet chaises, though they certainly took their share. It ran through every layer of the social order at once, from the townhouses of Mayfair down through the terraced streets of Manchester mill workers, all the way to the damp cottages of agricultural labourers who could not afford a doctor, but could always afford a penny bottle of the tincture that made the ache, the cough, the crying child, or simply the unbearable length of the day, temporarily more bearable. Class divided almost everything in this period with surgical precision, where you sat in church, what you were served at dinner, whether you were addressed by your first name or your surname. Laudanum did not care. It was the one truly classless institution Victorian Britain ever produced, and it achieved that not through any noble principle of equality, but because opium, unlike dignity, was cheap enough for everyone. Doctors themselves prescribed it constantly, for everything from diarrhea to anxiety to the common cold, because the pharmacological toolkit of the day was thin, and laudanum reliably did something, even if that something was simply make the patient stop noticing they were unwell. It shows up in surviving household account books next to entries for candles and coal, a routine domestic expense rather than a moral event. Novelists of the period wrote characters who dosed themselves without a flicker of scandal attached, because scandal was reserved for other things entirely, an unchaperoned walk, a lowered neckline, an inappropriate marriage. A bottle of opium and sherry on the nightstand was not a plot twist. It was furniture. The advertising, once newspapers got properly involved in the second half of the century, leaned hard into words like pure, genuine and family strength, as though opium tincture were a brand of soap competing on trustworthiness rather than a substance that could stop a person's breathing if the measuring hand slipped. Packaging varied by proprietor. Some bottles embossed directly in the glass with the maker's name to discourage counterfeiting, since counterfeit laudanum, weaker or stronger than advertised, was a genuine enough problem that reputable chemists made a selling point of consistency. A trusted brand was worth paying an extra halfpenny for, the same instinct that makes a modern shopper reach for a familiar box of headache tablets rather than the unlabelled version 2 shelves down, even though the active ingredient inside is often identical. Consider, for a moment, the modern equivalent you reach for without thinking each morning, the thing that lives on your own nightstand, glowing faintly, promising to take the edge off the day before the day has even properly started. You do not consider yourself dependent on it. You consider it maintenance. The Victorians would have understood you completely, and they would have been mildly disappointed that your version does not also smell of cinnamon. Downstairs, breakfast is being laid out, and next to the teapot sits a small dark bottle labelled as a tonic wine. The kind of thing a respectable household kept on hand the way you would keep aspirin. Except this tonic wine has been blended with actual coca leaf extract by a Frenchman who is about to become disturbingly rich. His name is Angelo Mariani, and his invention, a Bordeaux wine steeped with coca leaves from Peru, is called Vin Mariani, and by the time you are pouring a small glass of it alongside your kippers, it has already become one of the most successful branded products anywhere in the world. The alcohol in the wine acts as a solvent, drawing the cocaine alkaloid out of the leaves and into the liquid far more efficiently than chewing the leaf ever could, which means each modest glass delivers a genuinely brisk little jolt of stimulation riding on top of a very pleasant, very drinkable red wine base. It tastes, by most surviving accounts, like a slightly bitter, slightly medicinal claret, the sort of thing you could plausibly serve at a dinner party without anyone asking follow-up questions, mostly because at this dinner party nobody would think to ask. The coca leaves themselves arrived by ship from Peru and Bolivia in tightly packed bales, having crossed the Atlantic in a journey that took weeks, which meant Mariani was, in effect, running one of the first serious transatlantic supply chains built around a single psychoactive plant, decades before anyone used a phrase like global supply chain in relation to a beverage. He experimented for years with maceration times, worked out that a longer steep drew out more of the alkaloid without tipping the wine into unpleasant bitterness, and eventually patented his particular process, guarding the exact ratio of leaf to wine the way a modern beverage company guards a soft drink formula, right down to employees who were reportedly never told the complete recipe. The genius of Mariani was never really the wine itself. It was the marketing, and if you want to understand modern celebrity endorsement culture, wellness influencers, athletes with protein powder lines, actresses fronting skincare brands, you are looking directly at its ancestor. Mariani collected testimonials from the most famous people alive with the enthusiasm of a man building a scrapbook. Popes drank it, specifically Leo XIII, who reportedly carried a hip flask of the stuff and awarded Mariani a medal for his trouble, which is a sentence that should really be sat with for a moment. Presidents of the United States drank it. Sarah Bernhardt, the most famous actress on earth at the time, drank it and said so publicly. Thomas Edison drank it. Queen Victoria herself was reportedly counted among its admirers, which places the reigning monarch of the British Empire in the same consumer bracket as a Parisian stage actress and the inventor of the light bulb, all bonded by a shared enthusiasm for cocaine wine. The list of admirers kept growing. The novelist Jules Verne credited it with helping him work through the night on his manuscripts. Robert Louis Stevenson was rumoured to keep a bottle close at hand. and the sculptor Frederick August Bartholdi, fresh off completing the Statue of Liberty, is said to have joked that had he discovered Vin Mariani sooner, he might have made the statue a good deal taller. Whether every one of these claims was entirely spontaneous or gently encouraged by a complimentary case of wine delivered to the right address, is a question Mariani himself never felt obliged to answer. Mariani printed these endorsements on elaborate posters and trading cards, collectible even, with portraits of famous faces holding aloft their glass of tonic, captioned with glowing quotations about vigour and restored energy. It is structurally identical to a modern celebrity holding up a canned energy drink for a sponsored post, down to the vaguely medical language about focus and stamina, except this particular endorsement deal involved an actual psychoactive alkaloid rather than taurine and marketing copy. The wine was pitched not as a vice but as a tonic, a word doing enormous quiet work in this period, since a tonic implied restoration, health, vigour, return to a depleted body, rather than anything so vulgar as a drug. Vin Mariani did not invent the tonic wine, it simply did the category better than anyone else was doing it. The shelves around it were crowded with competitors making similarly bold claims without the coca leaf to back them up. Beef and iron wines promising restored blood, quinine wines promising relief from the shivering fevers so common in damp English towns, various malt and hop tonics promising simple robust vigour to anyone who could stomach the taste. Hall's Coca Wine, a British answer to Mariani's French original, advertised itself directly against the continental competitor, claiming equal potency at a more patriotic price. What separated Mariani from this crowded field was not really the coca, which several rivals also used, but the sheer scale and glamour of his marketing operation, which turned a fairly ordinary category of pseudo-medicinal drink into something resembling a luxury lifestyle brand a century before that phrase existed. And a breakfast table, of all places, is exactly where you would expect to find it, because that is precisely how it was positioned, a fortifying pick-me-up for people who had a long day of correspondence, calls and needlework ahead of them, not something furtive or late night. You take your small glass the way a modern person takes their first espresso, standing at the counter half-dressed, gathering the nerve to face the day. Except your nerve is arriving with a side of Peruvian coca leaf rather than Colombian bean, and nobody at your breakfast table considers this remarkable in the slightest. The effects, as described by drinkers at the time, were a gentle lift in mood, a sense of clarity, appetite suppression that upper-class women in particular came to appreciate rather a lot given the era's taste for a slender waistline, and a general reduction in fatigue that made the long, structured Victorian day of calls and correspondence and needlework feel considerably more manageable. It was recommended for singers to steady the voice, for athletes before exertion, for the elderly to restore vitality, for students cramming before examinations, which is to say it was recommended for essentially every human situation. The same catch-all promise stamped on wellness products today, minus the coca leaf, and, generally speaking, minus the papal endorsement. Mariani eventually inspired a wave of American imitators, most famously a pharmacist in Atlanta, who tried to bottle a similar tonic and when temperance pressures made the alcohol a liability, swapped it out for carbonated water and kept the coca leaf. That drink still exists. You have almost certainly had some this month, and it no longer contains cocaine, though it very much used to, and it built an empire on the exact same premise as the wine sitting on your Victorian breakfast table. Fortify yourself, one branded glass at a time. Breakfast, it turns out, has always been medicinal. It has just gotten quieter about the ingredients. Down the street, before the shops have even properly opened, the chemist is unlocking his door, and behind that door sits a counter stocked with substances that would, in a modern pharmacy, require several forms of government identification, and possibly a small tribunal. You step inside to a smell that is entirely its own category, a blend of dried herbs, beeswax, spirits of wine, and something faintly bitter underneath it all, that you eventually learn to associate with the raw material of medicine itself. Powdered barks, tinctures, mineral salts kept in ranks of labelled glass jars along shelves that climb to the ceiling. There is no prescription pad involved in this transaction, no waiting area, no consultation room. Until 1868, when the Pharmacy Act finally drew a legal line around a small number of named poisons, requiring them to be logged in a register with a purchaser's signature, a shopkeeper here could sell you opium, morphine, arsenic, cocaine or chloroform with roughly the same paperwork as a pound of tea. The shop window itself was doing marketing work of its own, typically dressed with a pair of large glass carboys filled with brightly coloured liquid, one red, one green, lit from behind by a lamp after dark. An internationally recognised signal readable from halfway down the street that told you, before you ever reached the door, exactly what kind of business operated here. Inside, opium and arsenic shared shelf space, with considerably more mundane stock, tooth powder, hair dye, scented soap, photographic chemicals for the increasingly popular hobby of amateur photography, digestive bitters, and patent cough drops. All of it dispensed from the same unhurried counter, so that a single visit might see you leave with a poison, a poultice, and a bar of violet-scented soap tucked into the same paper-wrapped parcel. Even after that act passed, the line it drew was thinner than you might hope, covering a specific list of poisons rather than opium generally, which remained widely and casually available for decades afterward, tucked into cough mixtures and soothing syrups that never had to call themselves anything alarming. Before 1868, though, the counter you are standing at is closer to a general store for controlled substances than anything resembling a modern pharmacy, and the man behind it dispenses with the brisk, unbothered competence of someone selling stamps. Arsenic sits there in white powder form, sold openly for killing rats, and also, more unsettlingly, purchased by respectable women who had heard it produced a fashionably pale complexion when taken in small doses. A claim with just enough grounding in truth to make it a genuinely popular, genuinely dangerous beauty regimen. Morphine, the purified and considerably stronger cousin of opium, sits in its own jar, available in powder or pill, sold to anyone with a headache serious enough to ask for it, and increasingly, as the century wears on, injected directly using the hypodermic syringe, a device marketed at first as a wonderful modern convenience rather than the beginning of an entirely new category of dependency. Cocaine arrives on these shelves in the later decades, sold as a treatment for hay fever, toothache and exhaustion, and briefly endorsed by no less a figure than a young Sigmund Freud, who wrote enthusiastically about its properties before the world quietly reconsidered. Chloroform sits nearby, both a surgical anaesthetic and, delightfully, a popular home remedy for toothache and insomnia. Administered by dabbing it onto a handkerchief and inhaling, a practice with an obvious ceiling on how many times it could go wrong before it did. Cannabis tincture is there too, prescribed for migraines, menstrual cramps and muscle spasms, recommended at one point by Queen Victoria's own physician for the relief of period pain, which is either extremely progressive or extremely on brand for the era, depending on your mood. What is genuinely disorienting, standing at this counter, is the shopkeeper's total nonchalance. He is not smuggling anything. He is not lowering his voice. He is measuring out a dram of laudanum for the elderly woman ahead of you in the queue, with the same unhurried patience he uses to wrap a bar of soap. And when it is your turn, he asks what troubles you the way a modern pharmacist might ask about your cold symptoms, listens to your answer, and reaches for a jar. There is browsing culture here too, in its own quiet way. Regular customers who come to know their chemist personally, who trust his judgment on dosage the way you might trust a barista to remember your order, who treat the whole shop less like a medical institution and more like a very well-stocked corner store that happens to sell substances capable of stopping your heart if you get the measurements wrong. Visiting the chemist was rarely a single, isolated errand. It sat comfortably within a longer circuit of the day's shopping, wedged between the butcher and the draper, and a housewife making her rounds might exchange the same unhurried pleasantries at each stop, commenting on the weather, inquiring after a neighbour's health, before finally stating her business at the counter. Regulars were greeted by name. The chemist might ask after the very complaint he had dispensed a remedy for the week before, a level of continuity of care that, in its own accidental way, rather outstrips what a good many modern patients receive from a rotating cast of unfamiliar faces behind a pharmacy counter that closes at 6. The chemist himself occupies a strange professional space, part scientist, part shopkeeper, part unlicensed doctor, dispensing advice on ailments that would today require a referral, a specialist, and a follow-up appointment. He has no formal medical degree, in most cases only an apprenticeship and a working knowledge of what tends to fix what. He was, in fact, frequently one of the most socially embedded figures on the street, in a way that had very little to do with medicine and a great deal to do with trust accumulated over years of unhurried conversation across that same counter. He extended credit to regulars who were short that week, remembered which household had a sickly child and which had a husband prone to gout, and functioned as an informal clearinghouse for local news in the process, the sort of person who knew discreetly rather more about the private business of the street than the vicar did. Shops were frequently family concerns, passed from father to son along with the apprenticeship that taught the trade, and a chemist with a reputation for fair dealing and good judgment on dosage could expect that reputation to outlive him by several decades, inherited by whichever relative took over the same counter, the same jars, and very often the same customers. And yet he is, for the vast majority of ordinary Victorians who cannot afford a physician, the only medical professional they will ever consult in their entire lives. He is your doctor, your pharmacist, and your dealer, all standing behind the same counter, all included in the price of the visit, which remains, throughout this entire era, essentially whatever is in your pocket that morning. Somewhere in the same street, a young mother is dosing her infant with a spoonful of cordial to stop it from crying, and she is doing it with love, with total confidence, and with absolutely no awareness that the cordial in question is roughly 1/3 opium by volume. The bottle in her hand is likely Godfrey's cordial, though it might just as easily be Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, imported from America and every bit as popular, or one of a dozen regional imitators with names like Atkinson's Infant's Preservative, which, in hindsight, is possibly the least reassuring product name ever printed on a Victorian label. All of them share the same basic formula underneath their cheerful branding: opium or morphine dissolved into a sweet treacle-thick syrup, flavoured to disguise the bitterness, sold in the same shops where you would buy candles and thread, aimed squarely at parents of infants, and marketed with the calm maternal confidence of a product that has never once been asked to justify itself. The word doing all the heavy lifting on these labels is quietness, or sometimes soothing, or settled, gentle euphemisms standing in for what is, chemically speaking, a sedation strong enough to render a newborn nearly unconscious. A crying baby is quieted, a restless baby is settled. Nobody on the label writes the actual mechanism, because nobody needs to. The mother buying the bottle already understands, in the vaguest and most comforting terms possible, that a spoonful makes the crying stop, and in a household with 6 other children, a husband on a 12-hour shift and absolutely no modern conveniences to speak of, a crying stopping is not a small thing. It is the difference between a functioning day and a collapsing one. Consider the mother in question a little more closely. Because she is very often not a woman of leisure fanning herself on a chaise, she is a factory worker, a seamstress, a laundress. Someone whose wages are needed the moment she is physically able to earn them again after childbirth, which in practice often meant days, not months. She cannot bring the infant to the mill floor. She leaves the baby with a minder, frequently an elderly neighbour, looking after 6 infants at once for a few pence a day, an arrangement that is essentially unlicensed, unregulated daycare running entirely on opium, since a minder with 6 crying infants and no assistants has exactly one reliable tool for keeping the peace, and it is sitting in a brown bottle on the mantelpiece. The practice was not evenly spread across the country, and the fens of Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire and Norfolk earned a particular reputation for it, an area of marshland where opium eating among adults was already unusually common, largely because the local ague, a malarial fever bred in the wet ground, made a cheap dose of opium the only affordable relief available to farm labourers for. Generations before the marshes were properly drained. Children in these districts grew up in households where opium was already a completely unremarkable presence on the shelf, and the leap from a father dosing his own fever to a mother dosing a teething infant was barely a leap at all, simply the same bottle serving a different member of the family. Visitors to the region in the middle of the century remarked, with a mixture of alarm and anthropological curiosity, on shop windows in small fen towns stacked with more opium pills and penny sticks of the raw gum than a visitor from London quite expected to see displayed next to the bread and cheese. It is worth pausing here to marvel, in the driest possible way, at the industrial scale of the whole operation. These cordials were manufactured by the barrel, sold by the hundreds of thousands of bottles annually, advertised in newspapers with cheerful illustrations of plump, contented infants, and dispensed by mothers who, by every account we have, believed themselves to be good and attentive parents doing exactly what good and attentive parents were supposed to do. There was no whisper of scandal attached to it in most circles. It sat on the shelf next to teething powders and cough drops, filed under ordinary household maintenance, the 19th century equivalent of a parent reaching for the pink bottle of children's fever medicine at 2 a.m. without a second thought. It was not as though nobody said anything at the time. Friedrich Engels, touring the industrial districts of Manchester in the early 1840s, wrote with open disgust about the trade in these quieting syrups, describing druggists who sold enormous quantities of them to mothers who could not otherwise mind their infants while working a 12-hour shift. Medical journals ran periodic warnings across the middle decades of the century, and a handful of coroners began, gradually, to note the connection publicly in their verdicts, rather than filing infant deaths as simple convulsions or teething complications. The polite catch-all causes that had absorbed the true story for years beforehand. None of it moved terribly quickly. Regulation, when it finally arrived with the later Pharmacy Acts, tightened the sale of the raw ingredients considerably more than it ever managed to tighten the branded, cheerfully labelled cordials that used them, which continued to sell in slowly diminishing form well into the 20th century. The real cost of all this quietness, and it deserves to be named plainly even in a segment that is otherwise inclined to snort at the whole arrangement, was a documented, statistically visible rise in infant mortality directly linked to these products, enough that public health reformers spent decades campaigning against them before regulation finally caught up. Coroners of the period grew wearily familiar with cases of infants found dead in their cots after a dose that was, by modern measurement, wildly excessive for a body that small. An outcome nobody selling the bottle intended, and very few parents ever suspected was possible. It is the one thread in this entire era of casual, everywhere opium that refuses to stay purely funny no matter how you frame it, and it sits there under the surface of every cheerful advertisement like a hairline crack in good china. And yet the tone of the era around it remained, almost defiantly, upbeat, because the alternative, acknowledging that half the infants in the country were being lightly sedated on a near-daily basis, was simply not a conversation Victorian domestic culture particularly wanted to have out loud. Which tells you something rather useful about every generation, including your own, and the particular talent every era seems to share for finding a way to make the thing that quiets the baby also the thing nobody asks too many questions about. At 11 o'clock, in a perfectly respectable parlour, a perfectly respectable woman excuses herself, mentions her nerves, and retreats upstairs for what everyone in the household politely refers to as a lie-down, which is, in practice, a fairly serious appointment with a laudanum bottle and absolutely nobody's business but hers. Nerves, in this context, is doing an extraordinary amount of quiet cultural work, because it is not really a diagnosis so much as a permission slip. A single vague, endlessly flexible word that could describe anything from genuine anxiety to boredom to grief to the completely unremarkable fatigue of running a household with no modern appliances and a husband who considers domestic labour to be something that simply happens on its own. Its slightly older cousin, the vapors, served much the same purpose a generation earlier, both terms functioning as an all-purpose medical shorthand for female distress that nobody particularly wanted to interrogate further. A woman with nerves required rest, quiet, and medicine. A woman without an approved word for her unhappiness required nothing at all, which is presumably why the word proved so popular. The medical framework propping all of this up reached back considerably further than Victoria's reign, all the way to an ancient Greek theory that a woman's womb could, under distress, wander loose around her body and cause chaos wherever it settled, which is where the word hysteria comes from in the first place, hystera being Greek for womb. The Victorians had long since abandoned the literal wandering organ, but they kept the underlying assumption almost entirely intact that female anatomy itself was the source of female instability, and built an entire respectable medical specialty around treating it. The American physician Silas Weir Mitchell would later formalise this into the rest cure, prescribing total bed rest, isolation from family, a rich fattening diet, and an explicit ban on reading or any form of intellectual stimulation for women diagnosed with nervous exhaustion. A treatment that struck at least one of his own patients, the writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, as considerably closer to torture than therapy, and which she turned into a rather pointed short story about wallpaper shortly afterward. The remedy prescribed for nerves, virtually without exception, was laudanum, dispensed by physicians with the same reflexive ease a modern doctor might once have reached for a benzodiazepine prescription pad treating anxiety, insomnia, and general female malaise as functionally identical conditions requiring functionally identical medicine. It did not particularly matter what the actual underlying cause was, whether it was a genuine mental health crisis, an unhappy marriage, a stillbirth nobody in the household was permitted to discuss, or simply the crushing tedium of a life with almost no permitted outlet beyond needlework and correspondence. The bottle did not ask questions, and neither, generally, did the physician who prescribed it. What makes this particular corner of the era so quietly absurd is how thoroughly it was woven into the ordinary rhythm of respectable domestic life. So much so that a lie-down became a recognised, unremarkable fixture of a woman's day, discussed with the same mild, incurious tone as an afternoon nap. Nobody in the parlour raises an eyebrow. Nobody follows her upstairs to check on her. The household simply continues, tea is poured, correspondence is written, and everyone understands, without a word needing to be said, that the vicar's wife will reappear in an hour or two considerably calmer, considerably softer around the edges, and that this is simply how certain days go. The structure of a respectable Victorian woman's day left, on paper, remarkably little room for genuine rest, and perhaps that is part of why the lie-down carved out such a stubborn place within it. Mornings belonged to household management, menus agreed with the cook, correspondence answered, mending inspected. The early afternoon belonged to calls, the elaborate and strictly timed ritual of visiting or receiving other respectable women for exactly the correct quarter of an hour, a social obligation with almost military precision behind it. Evenings belonged to the family, and, often enough, to entertaining. An 11 o'clock retreat to the bedroom, then, was one of vanishingly few moments in the entire day that belonged to nobody but her, which perhaps explains why it was tolerated so readily by a household that otherwise expected a woman to be perpetually and visibly useful. It was rest disguised as illness, smuggled into a schedule that had no other legitimate space for it. The double standard sitting underneath all of it is worth lingering on, because the entire framework depended on a very particular Victorian idea of female delicacy. The notion that women, and especially women of a certain class, were simply built with more fragile nervous systems than men, prone to collapse under stresses that a man was expected to absorb through sheer force of character. This was, conveniently, also an extremely useful idea for dismissing any woman whose unhappiness became inconvenient, since a diagnosis of nerves could explain away anger, ambition, grief, or restlessness alike, medicating the symptom while making absolutely no inquiry into the cause. It is not a coincidence that the women who feature most heavily in later historical accounts of laudanum dependency were disproportionately women whose lives offered them very few other approved forms of protest. The servants, meanwhile, know precisely what is happening upstairs, because servants always know precisely what is happening. They are the ones refilling the bottle, tidying the room afterward, discreetly managing the household schedule around the mistress, lie down without ever being so vulgar as to name it. Their discretion is not optional, it is essentially part of the job description, a silent contract in which everyone below stairs understands the arrangement, and nobody above stairs ever has to acknowledge that they understand it too. It is a beautifully Victorian solution, an entire household organised around a shared comfortable silence, propped up by good china, good manners, and a bottle that never quite runs empty. Picture, for a moment, the modern equivalent, the wellness retreat, the quiet weekend away, the vague and endlessly acceptable phrase taking some time for myself, all of it doing roughly the same social work that nerves once did, offering a respectable vocabulary for needing to disappear for a while without anyone asking too many follow-up questions. The vicar's wife would recognise the impulse instantly. She would simply be a little surprised that your version does not come with a spoon. The factory bell rings and a river of workers pours through the gates, and tucked into more pockets than you would guess is a small bottle of pick-me-up tonic, sold specifically to men and women who need to stand at a machine for 14 hours without their body noticing how unreasonable that is. You are standing in a cotton mill in Lancashire, or a woolen mill in Yorkshire, or a pottery in Staffordshire where the air itself has a texture, and the noise of the looms is so constant that by midday you have stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. The shift began before sunrise. It will end well after dark. Somewhere in the middle of that stretch, a bell will ring for a meal break so short it barely counts as punctuation. This is the rhythm of industrial Britain, and the human body, frankly, was not consulted before the schedule was drawn up. The mill itself was built to serve the machinery first, and the people running it a distant second. Windows were often nailed shut, and the air kept artificially warm and damp, because damp air kept cotton thread from snapping. The result was a workroom thick with airborne cotton fibre that workers breathed for the length of every shift, a condition mill hands eventually nicknamed mill fever, decades before anyone attached a proper medical name to the lung disease it left behind. Children as young as 9 or 10 worked as scavengers and piecers, ducking beneath the moving machinery to clear jammed threads while the frames kept running. Set against that backdrop, a bottle that quietened the body's protests looks less like an indulgence and more like standard issue equipment. So the body gets help, not rest, because rest is not on offer, but a chemical substitute for rest, sold over the counter of the local chemist or grocer for pennies. You might reach for something called a nerve tonic or a cordial, or in its most famous form, Collis Brown Chlorodyne, a small brown bottle containing a friendly little committee of opium, chloroform and cannabis tincture, marketed for absolutely everything from toothache to cholera to the general condition of being alive in a Victorian factory town. It does not technically give you energy. What it does is quiet the parts of you that would otherwise be screaming about the 14 hours, which, from the perspective of getting through the shift, works out to roughly the same thing. Collis Brown chlorodyne was hardly working alone. Chemist shelves carried an entire supporting cast, Batley's sedative solution, a straight opium preparation prescribed as casually as a headache powder, and the ominously named Black Drop, a stronger cousin of laudanum favoured by those who found the standard tincture too gentle. Advertisements for these products read like a modern wellness brand copywriter got their hands on a chemistry set, promising to soothe, to restore, to calm the nerves, every claim carefully avoiding the word opium anywhere on the label. Think about that logic for a moment, because it is worth sitting with. The tonic is not marketed as a way to feel good. It is marketed as a way to feel less, precisely enough that you can keep standing. This is fatigue culture with a label on it, a full century before anyone coined the phrase hustle culture. And it raises an uncomfortable question for anyone drinking their third energy beverage of the workday while eyeing a productivity app that tracks how many hours they have optimized a day. The tools change. The bargain, work through the exhaustion by chemically overriding your own alarm system, has been running a very long time. In the fens, out in the flat wet farmland of Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire, the arrangement was even more direct. Labourers there worked the drained marshland where ag, a recurring malarial fever bred by the damp, was practically a local weather pattern. Laudanum, the tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was the standing remedy, sold openly and cheaply by grocers and chemists alike, no prescription required, no doctor in sight. In some of those fen villages, by multiple contemporary accounts, a dose of laudanum cost less than a pint of beer. Consider what that does to a household budget and a habit at the same time. If the sedative is cheaper than the pub and available at the same counter where you buy your tea and your candles, it stops being a vice in any dramatic sense. It becomes a household staple, sitting on the same shelf as the flour. This pattern was noticeable enough that it eventually caught official attention. In 1863, a government medical investigator sent to survey child health and mortality on behalf of the Privy Council toured the fen districts and came back with bewildered notes on what local doctors were calling the fen opium eater, a recognisable local type, sallow-skinned, slow-moving, with a particular glassy, half-present look of someone permanently a little bit medicated. Local chemists, when asked, described selling penny sticks of opium the way a modern shop sells chewing gum, over the counter, no questions asked. Mothers used it too, and not only for themselves. Infants left at home while both parents worked the mill were sometimes given small doses of Godfrey Cordial or Dolby Carminative or similar soothing syrups built on opium to keep them quiet through the long day. A crying baby in a house with no adult present to feed or comfort it was a genuine crisis, and this was, in its bleak way, a solution. It is easy from the comfortable distance of your own century to be appalled by this. It is harder to sit with the fact that the working parents doing it were not monsters. They were people with no childcare, no safety net, and a bottle on the shelf that promised to make an impossible day slightly more survivable. Back on the factory floor, imagine the version of you clocking in at 5 in the morning, joints already aching from yesterday, reaching for the little bottle the way a modern office worker reaches for the first coffee of the day, except this coffee also quietly numbs your hands. The mill owner is not asking how you feel. The mill owner is asking whether the shuttle is still moving. Your job, as far as the machine is concerned, is to be a reliable extension of it for the length of the shift, and if a tonic helps you do that, nobody upstairs is inclined to ask what is in the bottle. There was no regulation requiring them to, and precious little requiring you to know either. The label might say soothing, or cordial, or nerve restorer. Entirely truthful words that happen to describe opium without once using the word opium. There is something almost admirable in how thoroughly this substance embedded itself into ordinary domestic life, without anyone treating it as remarkable. It sat next to the vinegar. It was recommended by neighbours the way you might recommend a brand of headache tablet today. Doctors of the period, when they were consulted at all, often prescribed it themselves, since it was, by the medical standards of the day, a perfectly reasonable tool, and arguably kinder than most of the alternatives on offer. The line between medicine and coping mechanism was not blurry in Victorian Britain. It simply did not exist yet as a line anyone thought to draw. So picture the whistle blowing at the end of the day, the workers streaming back out through the gates, considerably more tired than they were permitted to admit, some of them already thinking about the next dose before the next shift. The way you might already be thinking about tomorrow morning's alarm before you have even fallen asleep tonight. The mill kept running through the night in some seasons, lit by gas lamps, staffed in shifts. An industrial engine that did not particularly care whether the humans feeding it were rested, so long as they were upright. The tonic bottle goes back in the pocket, half empty, ready for tomorrow, which will apparently also require 14 hours of not noticing your own exhaustion. Turns out the snooze button has been around longer than the alarm clock. Across town, a dentist is preparing to remove a tooth, and the anaesthetic of choice is a gas so entertaining that half his patients arrive not because their tooth hurts, but because they heard the last person who left his chair could not stop laughing for 20 minutes. The gas in question is nitrous oxide, and by this point in the century it has already lived an entire previous life as pure entertainment before anyone thought to put it to practical use. Back at the end of the 1700s, a young chemist named Humphrey Davy, working at the Pneumatic Institution in Bristol, began inhaling the gas himself out of scientific curiosity. And what he found was not medical utility, but something closer to euphoria. He wrote about it with the breathless enthusiasm of a man who has just discovered his favourite thing in the world, describing a pleasurable, thrilling sensation, and, at one particularly memorable low point in scientific restraint, laughing and dancing around his laboratory. He even suggested, quite seriously, that the gas might be useful for surgery, since it seemed to dull pain. It would take roughly 45 years for anyone in medicine to take that suggestion seriously. In the meantime, everyone else took it very seriously indeed as a party trick. Davy did not simply try the gas quietly and move on. He wrote up his findings at exhausting length in a book published in 1800, titled with a thoroughness only a chemist besotted with his own discovery could manage. Research is chemical and philosophical, chiefly concerning nitrous oxide, a fair portion of which reads less like a scientific treatise and more like an enthusiastic diary. He also invited friends round to the Pneumatic Institution to try it, and his guest list reads like a greatest hits of Romantic era literature. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge inhaled it and compared the sensation to returning from a walk in the snow into a warm room, while Robert Southey, another poet and future poet laureate, declared he believed the atmosphere of heaven itself must be composed of nothing but this gas. Because that is what nitrous oxide became for the better part of half a century, a public entertainment. Touring lecturers, part scientist and part showman, would travel from town to town, hosting laughing gas demonstrations, charging admission for the privilege of watching audience volunteers stagger up onto a small stage, inhale from a bag or bladder connected to a gas supply, and then provide the evening entertainment entirely for free. Some volunteers laughed uncontrollably. Some wept. Some became convinced they could fight anyone in the room and attempted to prove it. Some simply stood there grinning in a way that suggested they had briefly left their body somewhere pleasant and were in no hurry to retrieve it. The crowd naturally loved every second of it, because watching your neighbour lose all inhibition in a public hall is, it turns out, timeless entertainment regardless of century. Chief among the travelling showmen was a man named Gardner Quincy Colton, an American lecturer who built a touring business around the gas, hiring halls, charging admission, and inviting local volunteers up to inhale from the bag while the audience settled in for the show. It was, in fact, one of Colton's own demonstrations in Hartford, Connecticut, that Horace Wells happened to attend, which makes Colton entirely by accident one of the more consequential circus promoters in the history of medicine. He later reinvented himself as a respectable administrator of the very gas he had once sold as spectacle, running dental clinics that offered nitrous oxide extractions by the thousands. Think of it as the 1800s equivalent of a stand-up comedy show, where the audience does not know which member of the crowd is about to become the show, which is a far more efficient business model than paying a single comedian. It was in fact at one of these very demonstrations in Hartford, Connecticut in 1844 that a dentist named Horace Wells watched a volunteer injure his leg badly while under the influence of the gas and report feeling no pain at all. Wells, who spent his working life causing people pain for a living and would very much have preferred not to, had something of a professional epiphany on the spot. He arranged to have a tooth of his own extracted the following day under nitrous oxide, and it worked. The dental profession, which up to that point had offered patients a firm grip on the chair arms and a polite suggestion to be brave, suddenly had an actual answer. News of this crossed the Atlantic quickly enough that British dentists began adopting it too, and by the back half of the century, a dental appointment in London or Manchester might genuinely include a small dose of the same gas that, in a slightly different social setting, was being sold as a ticket to a public laughing spectacle. Imagine explaining that to a modern dentist. Imagine the paperwork. And yet there it is, sitting in the actual historical record, the gas that made you giggle uncontrollably in a lecture hall being handed to you again a decade later so you could sit still long enough to have a molar pulled without screaming. You can picture the waiting room of one of these dental practices, patients sitting with the particular mixed dread and morbid curiosity that only a dentist appointment can produce, and among them someone who is not there for a toothache at all, someone who heard through a friend of a friend that the fellow who left the chair last Tuesday could not stop laughing about a hat for the better part of half an hour, and who has decided that this sounds like a perfectly reasonable Tuesday afternoon activity. The dentist, to his credit, generally did not ask too many questions about motive, since a willing patient in the chair was a willing patient in the chair. There is something wonderfully backwards about a piece of medical equipment doubling as party entertainment, and it says a great deal about how thin the line was, in this era, between a hospital procedure and a stage act. The gas did not change. Only the room around it changed. Sometimes a lecture hall with a paying crowd, sometimes a surgery with a reclining chair and a set of dental pliers waiting nearby, and the sensation itself, by every account, stayed remarkably consistent between the two. A floating, warm hilarity that made whatever was happening to your body feel like it was happening to someone else, someone considerably more amused about it than you would otherwise have been. The transition from parlour trick to standard medical practice was not, it should be said, a smooth or a particularly generous one. Horace Wells attempted a public demonstration of nitrous oxide extraction in Boston in 1845 that went badly wrong when the gas bag was removed too soon and the patient cried out, and Wells left the demonstration humiliated, his claim to the discovery overshadowed soon after by rival anaesthetics, ether and later chloroform. The following years saw an unseemly public scramble among several men, Wells among them, over who truly deserved recognition for having tamed pain itself, a dispute that ended, in Wells' case, in tragedy rather than vindication. Nitrous oxide itself quietly outlasted the argument, sidelined for a while by its flashier rivals before drifting back into routine dental use by the century's end. Modern dentistry still uses it, of course, under the far more clinical name of a mixture of nitrous oxide and oxygen, delivered through a small mask rather than a bladder passed hand to hand around a public hall. And modern patients still occasionally emerge from it, giggling at nothing in particular, which suggests that some things about the human nervous system have simply declined to modernise, along with everything else. So next time a dentist offers you the gas and calls it routine, remember that its Ursum includes several decades as a touring comedy act, and act accordingly unimpressed. In a university town, a group of well-dressed young men and women have gathered in someone's parlour not to drink, but to pass round a handkerchief soaked in ether, an activity so popular among the bored middle classes that it eventually needed its own polite little name. That name was the Ether Frolic, and if it sounds like something invented for a comedy sketch, it was in fact a real and thoroughly documented social fad, particularly noted in Ireland, especially in Ulster, from around the 1840s onward, though it turned up among students and the fashionably idle elsewhere too. The appeal was straightforward enough. Ether, a clear and extremely volatile liquid already known to medicine as an anaesthetic, produced when inhaled a rush of light-headed intoxication. A giddy, floating, slightly ridiculous sensation, not unlike being very drunk very quickly, minus the part where anyone had to drink anything. The practice took a specially deep root around towns like Draperstown in County Londonderry, and spread through much of mid-Ulster, where it persisted not as a passing fad, but as a genuine and stubborn local habit that outlasted the Victorian period entirely, still being reported by concerned doctors and druggists well into the early 20th century. What began as parlour entertainment for the fashionable young eventually filtered down through the wider population, and ether drinking, taken neat rather than merely inhaled from a handkerchief, became enough of a public health concern in the area that it drew the attention of physicians writing in medical journals, baffled by a habit that seemed to defy every attempt at official discouragement. One physician surveying the district described entire fairs and market days where the crowd smelled less of drink than of a chemist's dispensary, farmers and labourers alike nipping from small bottles between transactions, sober by the letter of the law and thoroughly unsteady on their feet all the same. Prescriptions were rarely required, since ether sat on the open shelf alongside cough mixtures and liniments, priced low enough that a habit could be maintained on the loose change left over from a morning at market. And that last detail mattered enormously, because much of the appeal of ether in Ireland specifically was tangled up with the temperance movement, which by mid-century had convinced enormous numbers of people to take the pledge and give up alcohol entirely. Whiskey was out. Beer was out. A quiet handkerchief passed around a parlour that happened to leave everyone in the room giggling and unsteady was, by the letter of the pledge if not remotely by its spirit, technically fine. It was not drink. Nobody had broken any promise. You can imagine the internal logic of the person making that argument to themselves, and you can also imagine how thin that logic looks from any angle other than the one specifically chosen to justify it. Part of what let ether outcompete whiskey in these communities was, bluntly, arithmetic. Ether was not subject to the same duties and excise levies that alcohol carried, which meant a bottle could be had from the local chemist or grocer for considerably less than the equivalent evening at the public house, and unlike a bottle of whiskey shared among friends, a small vial of ether went a remarkably long way, given how little of it was needed to produce the effect. A publican watching custom drift away to the chemist next door might reasonably have felt he was losing business to a competitor who had found a way to sell drunkenness without paying the tax on it, which is not a complaint that has entirely vanished from any economy that taxes one vice while leaving a chemically similar one alone. This is, in essence, the exact same manoeuvre performed by a modern person who has sworn off drinking and then spends the evening deeply committed to a vape, or a nicotine pouch, or a mocktail that has been quietly upgraded with something stronger, while nobody asks too many questions, on the grounds that whatever it is not technically the thing they promise to avoid. The pledge gets kept in letter and murdered in spirit, and everyone involved nods along because the alternative is admitting the whole exercise was a loophole from the start. Picture the room itself. It smells sharp and faintly sweet, a smell that clings to fabric and hair and lingers on the breath. closer to the smell of a hospital corridor than anything you would want at a party. And yet here it is at a party. Because the young and fashionable will locate a good time inside almost any available chemical, if the alternative is being bored on a Tuesday evening in a small provincial town with nothing else to do. The handkerchief goes from hand to hand, someone inhales, pauses, and then collapses into a fit of laughter over something that would not, under any sober scrutiny, be funny at all. Someone else grows suddenly and intensely philosophical about the wallpaper. A third person simply lies back against the settee with the blissful, unfocused expression of someone who has briefly forgotten they have a body. The effects came on fast, since ether vaporizes at a temperature not far above room warmth, meaning the handkerchief itself is doing very little work beyond acting as a wick. And they faded fast too, which made the whole activity oddly well suited to an evening of repeated rounds. Top up the handkerchief, pass it along, repeat, in a rhythm not unlike refilling a glass at any other kind of party. There was inevitably a hangover, generally described as a headache considerably worse than the ether high had been pleasant, which is the sort of trade the universe tends to insist on regardless of which century you are cutting the deal in. There was also the small matter of ether being spectacularly flammable, a detail that made the combination of a crowded parlour, an open flame for lighting the room, and a volatile vapour drifting from hand to hand considerably more dangerous than anyone at the party was inclined to dwell on. Reports from the period describe rooms that had to be aired out before anyone dared bring in a candle, and the vapour itself, being heavier than air, had a habit of pooling near the floor in a way that made the whole exercise a fire risk dressed up as a social occasion. That nobody seems to have burned a parlour down with any regularity is either a testament to Victorian caution or simply good luck holding for longer than the odds suggested it should. It is worth pausing on how genuinely strange it is that this counted as the responsible option. Ether is flammable, faintly toxic in enough quantity, and entirely capable of knocking a person unconscious if the dose runs long, which is precisely why doctors used it for surgery. None of that stopped anyone, because the entire appeal rested on a technicality, and once a group of respectable young people have collectively decided that a technicality grants them permission, remarkably little will talk them out of it. Temperance societies, watching this unfold, were not thrilled, and some ministers spoke out against the practice with roughly the enthusiasm you would expect from people who had just watched their own movement get outmanoeuvred by a pharmacy shelf. But the frolics continued for a good while regardless, a small, giddy, ether-scented rebellion carried out entirely within the bounds of a promise its participants were technically keeping. Eventually the fashion faded, the way fashions do, nudged along by growing awareness of the actual risks, and by the simple fact that trends among the bored middle classes rarely last as long as the middle. Classes themselves believe they will at the time, but for its run, the ether frolic stands as one of the more perfect little monuments to the specific talent people have for finding the exact loophole in their own rules, and then walking through it while insisting, quite sincerely, that the rule is still fully intact. Somewhere, the temperance pledge is technically unbroken and entirely defeated at the same time. Down by the docks, in a narrow room lit by a single oil lamp, a dozen men lie on low wooden bunks with long pipes, and a journalist has just arrived to write a horrified article about it, which he will do right after he tries it himself, purely for research. The room in question sits somewhere in Limehouse, the small dockside district that had, by the later decades of the century, become home to a modest community of Chinese sailors, many of them employed by shipping lines running between Britain and East Asia, who settled near the docks between voyages the way sailors of every nationality have always settled near the water that pays them. Among them were a handful of men who kept small opium smoking establishments, modest rooms really, offering a pipe, a bunk, and a place to smoke among people who understood the ritual, the way a coffee house offers a specific kind of company along with the coffee. By any sober account, these rooms were small, few in number and largely unremarkable, patronised mostly by sailors, dock workers, and a scattering of curious locals. And yet in the Victorian imagination, and very much in the Victorian press, Limehouse became something closer to a mythical underworld. A fog, a choked labyrinth of vice, occupying a landmass roughly the size of Belgium in the popular telling, despite covering, in reality, a few narrow streets. The gap between the actual scale of the thing and its reputation is frankly the entire story. You can trace this reputation directly through the fiction of the era, which borrowed the opium den so often it practically became a piece of furniture. Charles Dickens, in his unfinished final novel The Mystery of Edwin Drood, opens with a scene in just such a den, and Dickens had in fact visited a real one in Shadwell for research before writing it, guided, by most accounts, by a local police officer. Which tells you something about how thoroughly this had already become an object of respectable curiosity, rather than a place respectable people actually spent their evenings. Arthur Conan Doyle sent Sherlock Holmes undercover into one in the story The Man with the Twisted Lip, disguised so effectively among the pipes and the smoke that even his closest friend fails to recognise him. Oscar Wilde has Dorian Gray wander into one in the novel bearing his name, seeking oblivion in exactly the sort of squalid, smoke-thick room that readers had by then been primed to expect. None of these writers were reporting facts. They were reporting atmosphere, and atmosphere sells considerably better than accuracy. This is where the journalist comes in, and he is a recognisable type even now. A respectable writer, working for a respectable paper, sets out to expose the horrors of the opium den to a horrified and fascinated readership, and in the course of his investigative duties finds it necessary, purely in the interest of thorough reporting, to lie down on one of the bunks and try the pipe himself. He will describe the experience in vivid, faintly relishing detail before returning to his desk to write several hundred words of stern moral disapproval about the very practice he has just personally sampled. This is not a rare occurrence in the journalism of the period. It is close to a genre convention, the expose that requires its author to partake for research purposes, and if that sounds familiar, it is because the same instinct animates a fairly large slice of modern media, the documentary crew that needs extensive first-hand footage of the vice they are condemning, the true crime host who lingers a little too lovingly on the details of the crime. The type had a real name, or rather several. James Greenwood, a journalist celebrated for his undercover exposes of London lowlife, including a famous stint posing as a pauper to spend a night inside a workhouse casual ward, turned his attention to the opium dens of the East End with the same method, going in personally and writing up the experience in vivid first-person detail for a horrified and fascinated readership. He was, by most measures, the founder of a whole tradition of what came to be called amateur casual journalism, the respectable writer temporarily disguising himself as the very underclass he was reporting on, and the opium den fit that formula almost too neatly, offering both a dramatic setting and a ready-made excuse to participate, rather than merely observe. Gustave Doré, the French illustrator, and the journalist Blanchard Gerald toured the same streets together for their 1872 book London, A Pilgrimage, and Doré duly produced an engraving of a Limehouse den, dim, crowded, and considerably more theatrical than the rooms themselves likely ever were, which then went on to illustrate the idea of the opium den in the minds of readers who would never visit one themselves. The real Limehouse dens, by contrast, appear to have been fairly sedate places. Contemporary observers who bothered to look past the fog machine version found small, poor, quiet rooms, more like a modest social club than a den of iniquity, frequented mostly by an ageing, dwindling population of Chinese sailors and a few English regulars. None of it remotely equipped to support the sprawling criminal underworld the newspapers kept insisting was operating out of it. The Chinese community in Limehouse itself was never large, numbering at most in the low hundreds. And yet, it was made to carry an entire genre of British anxiety about foreignness, vice, and the unknown corners of its own largest city. Wildly disproportionate to its actual size or influence. The census figures bear this out with a bluntness the newspapers never managed. By 1891, the Chinese-born population of the entire London area numbered only in the low hundreds, clustered mainly along Limehouse Causeway and the neighbouring Pennyfields, a couple of short streets that a determined walker could cover in a few unremarkable minutes. One proprietor in particular, a man generally known as R. Singh, ran a small den on Ratcliffe Highway that became something of a minor tourist destination for slumming journalists and curious gentlemen, and is widely believed to have supplied at least part of the inspiration for the opium den keeper Dickens describes in the opening pages of Edwin Drood. A single real shopkeeper, in other words, doing modest business out of a couple of rented rooms, ended up furnishing the raw material for an entire genre of fictional menace. The myth eventually outgrew even the newspapers that built it. In the early 20th century, the writer Sax Rohmer took the accumulated decades of fog, pipes, and shadowy foreignness and distilled them into the villain Fu Manchu, a character explicitly rooted in the Limehouse of popular imagination rather than the Limehouse anyone could actually visit, and the book sold by the hundreds of thousands, carrying the fictional version of the district further into the public mind than any factual account ever managed. By the time Rohmer was writing, the real Chinese population of Limehouse had already begun to shrink, aging sailors dying off with few new arrivals to replace them, so that the myth was, quite literally, outliving the neighbourhood it claimed to describe, a fictional empire built on a foundation that had nearly vanished. What you are left with then is a strange double exposure, a small, real place, largely unremarkable, and a vast, invented place, built almost entirely out of newspaper prose and novelists borrowing from each other. Laid over the top of it so thoroughly that the myth is, to this day, considerably more famous than the facts ever were. The journalist finishes his pipe, coughs politely, and heads back to his desk to be appropriately scandalised about it in print. First draft due by morning. Personal experience conveniently doubling as primary source material. Out past the docks, a merchant ship has just come in from the Far East, and while the official cargo is tea and silk, everyone on the dock knows there is a second, considerably more profitable cargo tucked below it that nobody is writing down. That second cargo, more often than not, was opium, and to understand why it was on that ship at all, you have to follow the trade back to its source, which runs through British-controlled India rather than through Britain itself. Under the East India Company, opium production in India, particularly in Bengal, was organised into something close to a state monopoly, farmers cultivating the poppy under contract, the harvested opium processed and packed at company factories, and the finished product auctioned off in Calcutta to independent merchants who would then carry it onward, mostly toward China, where a vast and growing market for it existed despite the Chinese government having outlawed its import outright. The mechanics of the operation were, in their bureaucratic way, remarkably tidy for something so destructive. The East India Company did not sell opium into China directly, since that would have meant openly breaking Chinese law under its own name, a piece of reputational laundering achieved instead by auctioning the finished chests at Calcutta to independent private merchants, who then carried it onward to the China coast and took on the legal risk themselves. The company collected its revenue at the auction stage, cleanly separated from the smuggling that followed, a piece of financial distancing that would look entirely familiar to anyone who has studied how a modern corporation structures a subsidiary to keep a messy business at arm's length from the parent brand. By the 1830s, opium had become one of the single largest sources of revenue for British India, propping up the colonial administration's finances so thoroughly that giving up the trade was never seriously entertained as an option, whatever the moral objections raised against it. This is the part of the story where the light comedic framing has to step aside for a moment, because what followed was not a charming historical curiosity, but a genuinely brutal piece of imperial business. The Chinese government, alarmed by the social and economic damage of widespread opium addiction and the silver draining out of the country to pay for it, tried repeatedly to halt the trade, and Britain, whose merchants and treasury had grown considerably fond of the profits involved, responded twice with war. The first Opium War in the early 1840s and the second running through the late 1850s into 1860 ended in decisive British victories, and the peace settlements that followed forced China to open more ports to foreign trade, cede Hong Kong, and effectively legalise the very import it had tried to ban. It is difficult to describe this as anything other than a war fought, in substantial part, to preserve the right to sell a nation a drug it did not want. The suffering this caused in China, in addiction, in social upheaval, in the sheer scale of the trade once it was forced open, was real and lasting, and it deserves to be named plainly rather than folded quietly into a joke. The Treaty of Nanking, which closed out the First Opium War in 1842, laid out the terms with a one-sidedness that left little room for interpretation. China ceded Hong Kong outright, opened 5 ports: Canton, Amoy, Foochow, Ningpo and Shanghai, to British trade and residents, paid a substantial cash indemnity to cover Britain's war costs, and granted British subjects extraterritoriality, meaning they could break Chinese law on Chinese soil and still only answer to British courts. Nowhere in the document was opium itself formally addressed, since the war had never officially been declared over opium in the first place, at least not on paper, which meant the trade simply continued, now with considerably less Chinese capacity to resist it, until the Second Opium War forced the issue again and finished the job of legalising the import outright. The scale of what the trade did inside China itself is worth pausing on, because it is easy to let a phrase like widespread addiction glide past without registering what it actually meant. By the closing decades of the century, contemporary estimates, imprecise but consistent in their general shape, put the number of regular opium users in China somewhere in the tens of millions. A population effect achieved not through any single dramatic event, but through decades of steady, legally protected commerce, chest after chest, ship after ship, year after year. Whole regions of the Chinese economy reorganized themselves around supplying or consuming the drug, and the silver that drained out of the country to pay for it left the Qing government perpetually short of the funds needed to respond to the crisis it was watching unfold in its own cities and countryside. None of this happened by accident or oversight. It happened because it was profitable, and profitable enough that a British government otherwise fond of describing itself as a civilising influence twice sent gunboats to keep it that way. Back on the London docks, though, none of that geopolitical machinery was particularly visible to the average sailor or dock worker unloading crates. And this is where the more everyday, human-scale part of the story picks back up. For the men working the ships, opium was simply cargo, one commodity among many, tea in one hold, silk in another, and somewhere in the manifest or conspicuously absent from it, chests of opium bound for auction or for quieter private sale. Smuggling around the edges of the official trade was common enough, since a commodity this valuable. Moving through busy ports with underpaid customs staff and no shortage of sailors willing to supplement their wages was never going to move with perfect transparency. A little went missing here, a little appeared there, and dockside taverns did a healthy trade in conversation about exactly how that happened, always in tones just quiet enough to suggest everyone already knew, and nobody was going to write it down either. Sailors themselves, particularly those who had spent long stretches on the China run, sometimes came home with more than stories. Having picked up the habit of smoking opium the way it was practiced in Chinese ports, and it was this population, small but visible, that helped seed the modest opium smoking scene that would later show up around Limehouse. Meanwhile, the far larger and more thoroughly documented consumption of opium happening back on British soil. in the form of laudanum and its relatives, arrived by an entirely different and far more mundane route, through ordinary pharmaceutical import and domestic tincture production. No smuggling required, since it was, for almost the entire century, completely legal to sell. So the picture on the dock is really two economies running side by side. One, enormous, largely legal, and utterly reshaping the fortunes of British India. Chinese port cities and London trading houses alike, with a war or two thrown in to keep it running smoothly for the British side. The other, small, human scale and slightly furtive, a crate that goes unrecorded, a sailor with something extra in his sea chest, a dock worker who knows exactly which warehouse to walk past a little more slowly than usual. The first shaped nations, the second shaped a Tuesday night in a dockside pub. It is worth sitting, just for a moment, with how easily the two get separated in memory, the vast imperial machinery reduced to a footnote, while the small colourful detail of the sailor with the extra chest survives as the anecdote everyone remembers. History, much like the ship itself, tends to let the official manifest get all the attention while the real cargo rides quietly underneath it. The tea gets logged, the silk gets logged, the rest, as ever, gets remembered only by the people who carried it. In a rented room above a shop, a writer is scribbling furiously about the pleasures and terrors of eating opium, and the book he is about to publish will make an entire nation feel, for the first time, that being high and being literary are basically the same hobby. His name is Thomas de Quincey, a small, sickly, endlessly anxious man who has spent most of his adult life broke, in debt, and hiding from creditors in a manner that would make a modern gig economy freelancer feel seen. The year is 1821. The book is Confessions of an English Opium Eater, first serialised in a magazine and then bound and sold to a reading public that has never before been handed a first-person account of getting deliriously, philosophically stoned and finding it worth writing home about. Before this, opium was simply a household fact, sitting quietly on the shelf next to the vinegar. After this, opium has a mood board. You should picture the young De Quincey years earlier, a teenager who ran away from school and wandered the roads of Wales and then the streets of London half-starved, sleeping rough in doorways, essentially living the 18th century version of a gap year that has gone catastrophically wrong. It is on a rainy Sunday in London, tormented by facial pain, that he first walks into a chemist and buys a small vial of laudanum, and the relief that follows is described in prose so rapturous it reads like the copy on a very expensive skincare serum. He calls it a panacea for all human woes, a stopper pulled from the great secret of happiness, available for a shilling. Imagine a wellness influencer discovering on a Tuesday afternoon that the answer to their entire nervous system was sitting in a drugstore the whole time, and then imagine that influencer being significantly more talented at sentences than any wellness influencer has ever been. When the Confessions first appeared, serialised anonymously across 2 issues of the London magazine in September and October of 1821, it did not simply sell well, it detonated. Readers who had never given opium a second thought beyond the bottle in the medicine cabinet were suddenly arguing about it at dinner parties, and the publisher rushed out a bound edition the following year because demand for back issues had outstripped what any printer could manage. The book went through multiple editions in De Quincey's own lifetime and crossed the Channel decades later when the French poet Charles Baudelaire, already fascinated by his own relationship with opium and hashish, translated and adapted large portions of it into his 1860 collection Les Paradis Artificiels, introducing an entirely new readership to a small, broke Englishman's fever dreams. It is the rare case of a confession of personal ruin becoming, commercially speaking, an absolute smash. That is the first half of the book, The Pleasures of Opium, and it is gorgeous. Cities rearrange themselves into cathedrals. Time stretches out like warm taffy. A single evening can apparently contain 100 years of feeling. which is either a profound spiritual insight or an early and extremely wordy description of losing track of time on the sofa. But the second half of the book, The Pains of Opium, is a different animal entirely, filled with nightmares of a menacing figure he calls the Malay, endless recursive architecture, crocodiles, and a dread that presses down on him nightly like a physical weight. Reading the two halves back to back is a little like watching a beautifully shot travel vlog and then finding the director's cut where the influencer admits they cried in the airport bathroom every single day of the trip. The trouble, and the reason this particular book changed an entire century of British reading habits, is that readers overwhelmingly preferred the first half. The prose was too good, too seductive, too quotable, and it landed at a moment when romantic writers were already halfway convinced that suffering was simply the price of admission for genius. The poet Coleridge had his own long and miserable relationship with opium going back decades, reportedly begun as a treatment for rheumatic pain and only later understood as anything else, and he wrote some of his strangest and most haunting verse, including a famous unfinished poem about a pleasure dome, Under Its Influence. De Quincey did not invent opium use among writers. What he invented was opium use as a literary persona, a costume any sufficiently sensitive soul could put on, and Victorian Britain spent the rest of the century trying it on for size. Coleridge's own most famous brush with the drug produced, almost by accident, one of the strangest poems in the English language. By his own account, he fell asleep in a farmhouse near Porlock in 1797 after taking a dose of opium for an ailment, having just been reading a passage about the pleasure dome of a Mongol emperor, and woke with somewhere between 200 and 300 lines of vivid, complete verse arranged in his mind as though he had simply been shown them. He began transcribing what would become Kubla Khan, only to be interrupted, notoriously, by a caller from the nearby village on business, and by the time the visitor left an hour later the rest of the vision had dissolved, leaving him with a mere 54 lines and a note calling it a fragment, which is either the most famous case of writer's block in literary history or the most famous case of a very inconvenient doorbell. Unlike De Quincey, Coleridge never turned his addiction into a public brand. He was mortified by it, hid it from friends for years, and in 1816 effectively checked himself into the Highgate home of a physician named James Gilman, who spent the remaining 18 years of the poet's life carefully rationing his laudanum, a domestic arrangement that kept Coleridge alive and writing, but never entirely free. Later writers absorbed the influence in ways both direct and slightly embarrassing. Wilkie Collins, plagued for years by gout so severe it made his joints feel, in his own description, like they were being sawn open, wrote much of The Moonstone under a heavy and increasing dependency on laudanum, to the point where a pivotal plot device in that very novel revolves around the drug. Elizabeth Barrett Browning took it for chronic illness for most of her adult life, and it seeped quietly into the dreaminess of her verse. Charles Dickens opened his final, unfinished novel in an opium den in the East End of London, describing the pipe and the haze with the reporter's eye of a man who had clearly gone and looked at one in person for research purposes, which is either admirable dedication or an extremely dark field trip. What almost nobody discussed in polite drawing rooms, and what the beautiful hypnotic prose of the Confessions conveniently glossed over, was the actual daily reality of the man who wrote it. De Quincey remained bound to the drug for most of his life, his dosage swinging wildly across the decades, at his heaviest reportedly consuming quantities that would have felled a smaller book entirely. He was chronically in debt, chronically fleeing landlords, chronically estranged from a stable household, and by the time he revised the Confessions decades later, in 1856, he added new material admitting that the original version had, if anything, undersold the horror of the thing. The highlight reel had needed a director's cut after all, and even then he could not quite bring himself to show the whole picture. And that gap, between the elegant, dreamlike sentences and the exhausted, broke, sleepless man producing them at 3 a.m, became the template for an entire genre of confessional writing that still has not run out of steam. Every misery memoir, every beautifully written account of a rock bottom, every substance confessional with a moody cover photo owes this man an unpaid royalty. He is, essentially, the original influencer who made a personal crisis look like content, and Victorian Britain, tucked into its armchairs by candlelight, could not put the book down. Across the city, a physician is seeing his 10th patient of the day, and regardless of whether the complaint is a cough, a broken heart, or general Victorian malaise, the treatment he reaches for is once again a tincture of opium, because as far as medicine currently understands, opium is basically the answer to all questions. To understand him, you have to understand how little the medicine of this era actually knows. Germ theory has not yet arrived in any working form. Nobody in this consulting room believes that invisible organisms cause disease, because nobody has any real reason to. There is no reliable theory of infection, no concept of a virus, no blood test, no X-ray, no antibiotic, and precious little in the way of anaesthesia beyond a rag soaked in something flammable. Medicine in the middle of this century is still largely a matter of watching what seems to work and doing it again, which is not so different from a home cook who has never read a recipe but has strong, confident opinions about seasoning based purely on vibes. Training itself is a patchwork affair for most of the century. A young man wanting to become a doctor might apprentice himself to a surgeon apothecary for a handful of years, walk the wards of a teaching hospital, sit through lectures on anatomy and materia medica, and then present himself for one of a dizzying array of possible qualifications issued by different bodies with different standards. All before anything resembling a single national medical register exists. That register does not arrive until the Medical Act of 1858, which finally creates the General Medical Council and something approaching a unified profession. But even then it standardises who may call themselves a doctor far more successfully than it standardises what a doctor actually knows. Bleeding a patient, a practice that had dominated medicine for 2,000 years, is only slowly falling out of fashion during this period, and a physician trained in the 1820s might still reach for a lancet out of habit long after his younger colleagues have quietly stopped. And here is the thing. Opium does genuinely seem to work for an enormous range of ailments, because it does several useful things at once. It dulls pain reliably, better than almost anything else on the shelf. It slows the bowels, which makes it a real and effective treatment for the diarrhoea and dysentery that kill more Victorians than almost anything else on this list. It suppresses coughing, so it goes into every cold remedy and every bottle marketed at consumption, which is what they call tuberculosis. It brings on sleep. And, perhaps most importantly to a doctor sitting across from a grieving widow, or a woman diagnosed with the vague catch-all condition called hysteria, it soothes distress. Imagine a single product on a modern pharmacy shelf that claimed to fix your back pain, your stomach bug, your insomnia, and your grief in one go. And imagine that product actually working, at least for the length of an afternoon. You would buy it too. Everybody did. The forms it comes in are dizzying. There is laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, the workhorse of the medicine cabinet, cheap and available without prescription at the grocer or the chemist. There is Dover's powder, a mix of opium and ipecacuanha for fevers and colds. There is Batley's sedative solution, marketed as gentler and purer than laudanum, which it was not particularly. And for infants there is Godfrey's cordial, a soothing syrup handed to teething babies and colicky newborns by mothers and hired nursemaids alike. A practice that modern parents would consider somewhere between alarming and criminal, and that Victorian parents considered Tuesday. By the middle of the century, the shelf gets even more crowded. Dr. J. Collis Brown's chlorodyne, patented at mid-century, combines opium with chloroform and a dash of cannabis tincture into a single dark, treacly syrup marketed as a cure for cholera, diarrhoea, neuralgia, and practically anything else that ails a Victorian household, and it becomes so trusted a fixture of the medicine cabinet that soldiers carry it into the Crimean War and beyond. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, imported from America but sold enthusiastically across British chemist shops, performs much the same function as Godfrey's cordial for infants, advertised with beaming illustrations of plump, sleeping babies and marketed under the cheerfully reassuring nickname the mother's friend, a nickname that reads considerably less cheerful once you know what is actually dissolved inside the bottle. None of this happens in a total scientific vacuum, to be fair to the profession. Early in the century, a German pharmacist named Friedrich Saturner had isolated morphine from raw opium, identifying it as the specific active ingredient responsible for the drug's power and giving doctors, for the first time, something like a pure and consistent compound to work with, rather than a variable plant extract. Morphine arrives in Britain as an exciting refinement, injectable by the newly invented hypodermic syringe from the 1850s onward, and it is genuinely regarded, not unreasonably, as an advance in precision. What nobody has yet worked out is that a more consistent, more efficient way of delivering the drug into the bloodstream is not the same thing as a safer one, and the syringe, sold to a patient with instructions to use as needed, solves the problem of inconsistent dosing while quietly creating an entirely new one. None of these products come with a standard dose printed anywhere reliable. A bottle of laudanum from one chemist might be twice the strength of a bottle from the shop 2 streets over, and there is no governing body checking. Poisonings happen constantly, reported in local papers with a weary regularity that suggests nobody is especially shocked by them anymore, the way a modern reader might skim past a headline about a data breach. And yet the doctor prescribing all of this is not a villain. He is not cynical, not indifferent, not secretly aware that he is doing harm and covering it up. He has trained for years, he keeps up with the journals of his day as best he can, and by every standard available to him, he is doing careful, responsible, state-of-the-art medicine. He is essentially following the science, except the science has not yet gotten around to inventing the concept he would need to see the problem. That concept is addiction itself, at least in the medical sense we now take for granted, and it barely exists yet as a diagnosis. For most of the century, dependency on opium is understood, when it is discussed at all, as a moral failing, a matter of weak character, something that happens to other people, usually poorer people, usually people who have brought it on themselves through some deficiency of will. The idea that opium habituation might be a physiological disease process, something that could happen to a perfectly respectable person through nothing more than months of diligent doctor-approved use, does not gain real traction until quite late in the era, with writers on the subject only beginning to describe it in clinical terms toward the 1870s and 1880s. Before that, a doctor watching a patient need larger and larger doses over the years has no real framework for what he is seeing, except perhaps a stubborn case that requires more medicine. So he writes the prescription again for the cough and the broken heart and the general malaise, with the calm, unhurried confidence of a man reaching for the only tool in a very small toolbox, and by every measure of his own time, he is right to do so. Future centuries will judge him for it, the way future centuries always judge the well-meaning idiots who came before, largely because those future centuries have the enormous advantage of already knowing how the story ends. In the kitchen of a very ordinary terraced house, behind the jam and the good china, sits a small collection of bottles the lady of the house does not discuss with the vicar, does not discuss with her husband, and absolutely does not discuss with her mother, but discusses, quietly and often, with herself. There is nothing illegal about what is in those bottles. She bought at least one of them herself, over the counter, from the grocer down the street, the same establishment where she buys tea and candles, with no more ceremony than buying either. For most of this century, laudanum requires no prescription, no doctor, no explanation to anyone, and the shopkeeper who sells it to her thinks no more of the transaction than he does of weighing out sugar. If you are picturing a furtive exchange in a back alley, you are picturing the wrong century entirely. She purchased calm the way a modern woman might purchase a bottle of wine on the way home from work, an unremarkable errand, folded into an afternoon of other unremarkable errands. The secrecy is not about the buying, it is about the using, and more specifically about being seen to need it, which in her world are two entirely different crimes. Victorian respectability runs on the appearance of composure. A lady of the house is meant to be the calm, steady centre of the home, the figure later writers will describe, without a trace of irony, as the angel in the house, gliding serenely between the nursery and the drawing room and the dinner table, producing warmth and order on command regardless of what is actually happening inside her. There is no socially acceptable outlet for the fact that she is exhausted or grieving or simply bored out of her mind, so the bottle in the cupboard becomes the pressure valve nobody is allowed to acknowledge exists. The phrase itself comes from a poem, The Angel in the House, published in instalments by Coventry Patmore between 1854 and 1862, an adoring, wildly popular tribute to his own wife Emily that presents domestic self-sacrifice not as drudgery, but as a kind of quiet feminine sainthood, the highest calling a woman could aspire to. It sold extraordinarily well, was praised by critics of the day including John Ruskin, and became so thoroughly absorbed into the Victorian idea of what a good wife looked like, that most people reciting the phrase decades later had no idea it started life as a specific poem about a specific woman. It would take until 1931 for Virginia Woolf, in an essay on her own path to becoming a writer, to describe having to reach out and, in her words, kill this exact phantom before she could write an honest sentence, which gives you some sense of just how long the ideal managed to sit uninvited in the back of every respectable woman's mind. And it is worth sitting, for a moment, with just how narrow her days actually are. She likely cannot work outside the home if she is at all comfortably situated, cannot vote, cannot own much of anything separate from her husband under the law for much of this era, cannot travel unaccompanied without eyebrows being raised, cannot really discuss anything as blunt as her own unhappiness without being labelled delicate or worse. Her days are a tightly managed loop of household accounts, needlework, calling cards, and the relentless supervision of servants and children, performed inside a corset that restricts her breathing as efficiently as her circumstances restrict everything else about her. If you wanted to design a lifestyle optimized to produce quiet, private despair in an intelligent person, you would be hard-pressed to improve on the average upper-middle-class Victorian drawing room. Now imagine a wellness routine promising an escape from all of it, in a small brown bottle, requiring no doctor, no confession, no appointment, and taken alone in a room with the door closed. It is not difficult to understand the appeal. The isolation is not merely social, it is written directly into the law she lives under. For most of the century, a married woman exists as what the courts call a femme covert, her legal identity effectively absorbed into her husband's, meaning any wages she might somehow earn, any property she brings into the marriage, any inheritance that comes her way, belongs to him as a matter of course rather than to her. It is only with the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870, and more substantially, 1882, that she gains anything close to an independent legal claim to her own money and possessions. Reforms that arrive well after our housewife has already spent decades learning to manage a household she cannot, in any meaningful legal sense, be said to own a single teaspoon of. There is grief in that cupboard too, and an enormous amount of it, because this is a century in which death visits the average household with a regularity modern readers would find almost impossible to absorb. Infant mortality is brutally high. Childhood diseases carry off siblings, cousins, and her own children with a frequency that never quite stops being devastating, no matter how many times it happens. Mourning has its own strict wardrobe and its own strict calendar, but it has no real medical support beyond, once again, the bottle in the cupboard, dosed out in careful drops during the long, quiet hours after the house has gone to bed. She also reaches for it monthly, for the ordinary and unglamorous pains her doctor has no better answer for than the one he gives everyone else. And for the nights her mind simply will not stop turning over the accounts, the children, the husband, the endless small management of a life she did not entirely choose. Mourning itself has a uniform, and she is expected to wear it correctly. Black crepe, dull and stiff and scratchy against the skin, jet jewellery carved from fossilised wood, and a strict calendar dictating exactly how long a widow must remain in full black before easing gradually into the lighter half-mourning of greys and lavenders. A schedule that can stretch on for 2 full years after a husband's death, and rather less, tellingly, after a wife's. Queen Victoria herself, famously, never really leaves it at all after 1861, dressing in black for the remaining 4 decades of her life and turning personal grief into a kind of unofficial national dress code, which every ordinary widow in every ordinary parlour is then quietly measured against. It is a lot of fabric and a lot of ritual to manage a feeling that the bottle in the cupboard is in its small and private way doing rather more to actually treat. Her social world, such as it is, runs on a strict and exhausting choreography of its own. There are calling hours in the afternoon, the ritual of leaving cards with the corners folded just so to signal condolence or congratulation, an entire silent language of pasteboard that substitutes for the kind of frank conversation she is never quite permitted to have. Between those visits stretch long, empty hours in a house that is technically full of people. A husband at his club or his office, children upstairs with a nursemaid, servants moving quietly through rooms she is not expected to enter while they work, so that a woman can spend an entire day inside a crowded household and speak to no one as an equal from breakfast until her husband finally comes home for dinner. It is, in its own carpeted, well-upholstered way, one of the loneliest arrangements the century manages to produce. Nobody in her circle would call her an addict, because that word barely exists yet in the way you might mean it, and even if it did, it would never be applied to a woman so clearly, visibly respectable. She keeps her house immaculate. She receives callers with perfect composure. She raises her children, manages her servants, and sits through church twice on Sundays without incident. The bottle stays behind the jam, and the jam stays in front of the bottle, and both arrangements suit her very well, thank you, and no, she will not be discussing it further. A parcel arrives from a chemist advertising the wonders of Indian hemp. A tincture derived from cannabis that a doctor recently discovered in Calcutta and brought home with the enthusiasm of a man who has just found the greatest thing that has ever happened to headaches. The doctor in question is William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, a young Irish physician working in Bengal in the 1830s and 1840s, who becomes fascinated by the local use of cannabis preparations he encounters there, and who does something almost nobody in British medicine had bothered to do before. He actually tests it, carefully, first on animals and then, with what reads today as slightly alarming enthusiasm, on human patients. He tries it on cases of rheumatism, on cholera, and most strikingly on tetanus and the convulsions of rabies, conditions that at the time have essentially no reliable treatment at all, and he watches the tincture ease muscle spasms in ways that genuinely astonish him. By the time he returns to Britain and publishes his findings, he is convinced he has brought home a medical breakthrough, and for a while much of the profession agrees with him. O'Shaughnessy did not stumble onto cannabis in a vacuum. He held a professorship at the Medical College of Calcutta, one of the first institutions in India to teach Western medicine formally, and he drew directly on generations of existing local knowledge, learning to distinguish between the milder bang, brewed as a drink, the more potent ganja, made from the flowering tops, and shara as the resin. Distinctions Bengali cultivators and physicians had understood long before any European took an interest. His landmark 1839 paper, published through the Medical and Physical Society of Bengal, reads today as a genuinely careful piece of clinical observation, cautious about dosage and frank about failures as well as successes, which is more than can be said for a great deal of what passed for pharmacology in this period. He later left medicine almost entirely to help build India's electric telegraph network, which makes him one of the very few Victorians who can claim to have meaningfully advanced both stoned tetanus patients and the speed of imperial communication. You should picture the introduction of cannabis tincture into British medicine less like the arrival of a scandalous vice, and more like the launch of an exciting new pharmaceutical, written up with real seriousness in the medical journals of the day and picked up quickly by pharmacists eager for a new product to sell. Chief among them is a chemist named Peter Squire, whose firm produces a widely sold extract of cannabis indica that becomes something close to a household name in medicine cabinets, marketed for muscle spasms, convulsions, menstrual pain, and above all for sleep. It is sold by mail order and over the counter with roughly the same lack of fuss as the laudanum sitting on the next shelf, arriving by parcel post in tidy little bottles that would not look out of place, aesthetically, in a modern apothecary-style skincare display. The empire is, at the very same moment, growing hemp on an industrial scale for an entirely different purpose, rope and canvas and sailcloth for the ships of the Royal Navy, so that the same plant is quietly doing double duty across the Victorian world, holding a battleship together in one corner of the empire, while easing a headache in a Kensington sitting room in another, with almost nobody pausing to notice it is the same crop. Across the channel at almost exactly the same moment, a French psychiatrist named Jacques-Joseph Moreau, usually called Moreau de Tours, was arriving at cannabis from an entirely different angle, dosing himself and, notoriously, a circle of Parisian writers and artists with hashish in an effort to study madness by temporarily manufacturing something that resembled it. Out of these sessions grew the loosely organised Club des Hashishins, which met through the 1840s in a grand old house on the Ile Saint-Louis and counted among its occasional guests the writers Théophile Gautier and Charles Baudelaire, the very same Baudelaire whose later fascination with opium would lead him to translate De Quincey. Moreau's interest was clinical rather than recreational, an early and genuinely serious attempt to use a drug as a research tool for understanding the mind, even if the Parisian evenings themselves, by every surviving account, drifted rather quickly from scientific rigour into something closer to a very committed dinner party. Unlike opium, cannabis in tincture form does not reliably numb serious physical pain in the way patients and doctors alike hoped it might, and its effects vary wildly from person to person and dose to dose, since the tincture is famously inconsistent in strength depending on the plant stock used to make it. This unpredictability is actually one of the reasons it never quite dethrones opium as the great Victorian catch-all. But for muscle spasm, for the specific miseries of convulsive disorders, and for helping an exhausted or anxious patient drift towards sleep, it earns a genuine and lasting place in the medical toolkit, prescribed by serious physicians without a flicker of moral concern. In the same unbothered tone a doctor today might use recommending a mild sleep aid. And then there is the story that always gets told at this point, the one about the physician Sir John Russell Reynolds, who attended Queen Victoria and who became one of the era's most prominent champions of cannabis as medicine, publishing an influential paper in the Lancet late in the century praising it for conditions including painful menstruation. It is widely reported, and repeated in countless retellings since, that he prescribed cannabis tincture for the Queen's own monthly cramps, an image that tends to delight modern audiences precisely because it collides so entertainingly with the popular idea of Victoria as the humorless, permanently disapproving face on the coinage. The claim should be treated exactly as it survives in the historical record, which is to say as a widely circulated and plausible story, rather than a document you can point to with total certainty, since no surviving prescription slip has ever surfaced with her name on it. But the physician's own enthusiasm for the treatment, is entirely real and well documented. And it is not a stretch to imagine the monarch of the largest empire on earth reaching, on a bad day, for exactly the same small brown bottle sitting in far humbler cupboards across the country. By 1864, cannabis indica had earned an official listing in the British Pharmacopoeia, the government's own authoritative reference of approved medicines, placing it on exactly the same institutional footing as opium, quinine and digitalis, a level of establishment respectability that is easy to forget given how the plant is regarded today. Physicians across Britain, not just the handful whose names survive in the record, prescribed cannabis tinctures routinely for the rest of the century, without any of the moral hand-wringing that would eventually attach itself to opium, largely because cannabis never produced the same visible, headline-grabbing casualties. Nobody was writing sensational newspaper accounts of society ladies wasting away on hemp extract, so it simply got on with being medicine, quietly and without much fanfare, for decades. By the later decades of the century, cannabis tincture has settled into an odd, comfortable middle position in the Victorian medicine chest. It never carries the faint literary glamour that opium picked up from the poets, and it never becomes quite the universal household reflex that laudanum was, but it sits there quietly as a trusted, unremarkable remedy, recommended by respectable physicians, sold by respectable chemists, and taken by respectable patients for a headache, a set of aching muscles, or a night that simply refuses to end in sleep. It would take the 20th century and an entirely different set of anxieties to turn this same plant into a moral emergency. For now, it just arrives by post, mild and slightly bitter and entirely unremarkable, tucked in beside the tea order. In a studio thick with turpentine and candle smoke, an artist pours a cloudy green liquid over a sugar cube balanced on a slotted spoon, and the ritual is almost as important to him as the painting he is pretending to work on. He watches the water hit the sugar and drip slowly down into the glass below, turning the sharp emerald liquid a soft, milky opal, a transformation the French call the louche, and it is genuinely a small piece of theatre, performed with the same unhurried reverence a modern coffee obsessive brings to pouring water over freshly ground beans through a paper filter at exactly the right temperature. It is worth being honest here, because the story is often told a little crookedly. Absinthe is, first and foremost, a French and broader continental phenomenon, brewed and consumed in staggering quantities in the cafes of Paris, rather than the drawing rooms of London. But it does not stay politely on the other side of the channel. It crosses over with every English artist and writer who takes the boat to Paris to study, drink, argue about painting, and generally behave in ways their families back home would find deeply inconvenient to explain at dinner. In Paris itself, the ritual has a name and a schedule of its own, l'heure verte, the green hour, generally reckoned to fall somewhere between 5 and 7 in the evening, when cafe terraces across the city fill with clerks, artists, and everyone in between, all performing the identical small ceremony of water and sugar and slotted spoon at more or less the same time, block after block, like a citywide happy hour with better lighting. By the final decades of the century, French consumption has climbed to genuinely startling levels, rising roughly 20-fold across a few decades until the average person in France is getting through several litres of the stuff a year, a rate of national devotion that makes the occasional English enthusiast look, by comparison, like an amateur hobbyist dabbling in a foreign sport he has not quite learned the rules of. Oscar Wilde is, unsurprisingly, one of its great English champions, and the quips attributed to him about the drink, whether entirely accurate or slightly improved in the retelling over the decades, have done more to cement the mythology of absinthe in the English-speaking imagination than any amount of actual French advertising ever managed. Painters and illustrators moving in the orbit of the English aesthetic movement, figures drawn to Paris and its cafes as a kind of pilgrimage site for anyone serious about art, bring the ritual home with them, along with the spoons, the glassware and the reputation. Back in London, it never achieves the sheer, soaking, all-hours ubiquity it has in Paris. where entire cafes structure their afternoon around the hour set aside for it, but among the artistic set, it becomes a kind of passport, a way of signalling that you have been somewhere, seen something, and are not entirely to be trusted around polite company anymore. Beyond Wild, the drink finds a small but genuinely devoted following among the poets and illustrators clustered around the literary magazines of the 1890s. The poet Ernest Dowson, whose fragile health and famously self-destructive habits made him something of a patron saint for the decade, was rarely seen without a glass close at hand in the cafes of both Paris and London. And the illustrator Aubrey Beardsley, already dying slowly of tuberculosis and drawing some of the most startling black and white work of the era, moved in exactly the same absinthe-soaked circles before his death at 25. These were, by and large, young men fully aware they were playing a part, cultivating a reputation for doomed, beautiful decline with the same self-conscious care a modern performer might bring to curating an aesthetic online, except the props were real spirits, and the decline, in more than one case, turned out to be real as well. The drink itself is built around wormwood, along with anise and a handful of other herbs, distilled into a spirit so strong it would flatten most modern drinkers before dinner was even served, which is really the entire secret behind most of its famous effects. Before the water ever touches it, the liquor sits somewhere around 70% alcohol, roughly double the strength of an ordinary spirit, and it announces itself first through the nose, a sharp aniseed sweetness undercut by something bitter and faintly medicinal, the herbal equivalent of a very confident cough drop, before the sugar and water are allowed to soften the whole production into something a person can actually get through an evening drinking. The compound in wormwood that everyone becomes fixated on, called thujon, gets blamed across the following century for hallucinations, madness, and a whole catalogue of ruin, and it becomes genuinely difficult to find a single account from the period that does not credit the drink with some faintly supernatural power. In reality, the quantities of thujon present in a properly made glass are nowhere near enough to do any of that on their own, and the far simpler explanation that a very strong, frequently adulterated spirit consumed in large volumes by people who are also not eating regularly or sleeping well produces exactly the kind of derangement you would expect, was much less romantic and therefore much less popular. There was, admittedly, a genuine health hazard lurking in some glasses, just not the one everybody blamed. Cheaper, disreputable producers, eager to hit the right shade of green without paying for quality wormwood distillation, occasionally doctored their absinthe with copper salts to fake the colour and antimony compounds to fake the cloudy looch, and it was these actual poisons, rather than any mystical property of wormwood itself, that produced some of the more alarming and genuinely dangerous cases attributed to the drink. It is a very old story dressed in new clothes, the counterfeit, cost-cutting version of a product turning out to be considerably more dangerous than the real thing. A lesson every era seems to need to relearn for itself with whatever intoxicant happens to be fashionable at the time. The mythology that grows up around it is genuinely spectacular, and it deserves to be treated with the same fond scepticism you would bring to a modern superfood, marketed as curing everything from fatigue to heartbreak. The drink acquires the nickname the Green Fairy, imagined as a seductive, faintly dangerous spirit who lives inside the glass and whispers artistic inspiration into the ear of anyone who drinks enough of her, an idea painters find entirely too flattering to argue with. Posters and illustrations from the period render her as a winged, ethereal figure hovering over cafe tables, which is either a charming piece of folklore or the 19th century equivalent of a supplement company hiring an illustrator to draw a glowing aura around their product, depending on how cynical you are feeling. The panic follows the mythology exactly the way it always does, a few decades behind and considerably louder. Temperance campaigners on both sides of the channel seize on absinthe as a specific, nameable villain, distinct from ordinary drink, blamed for crime, for madness, for the general moral disintegration of an entire generation of artists and workers alike. And the fear reaches its peak on the continent early in the following century, culminating in outright bans in several countries, most famously France itself. England, never quite as absinthe-soaked to begin with, watches this continental drama largely from the sidelines, its own temperance anxieties already thoroughly occupied elsewhere. The society painter, for his part, remains entirely unbothered by any of it, pouring his water over his sugar cube with the calm, ritualistic patience of a man who has never once in his life allowed a moral panic to interrupt a good habit. On a chemist shelf sits a small bottle marketed cheerfully for children, promising instant relief from toothache, and the active ingredient, printed in small confident letters on the label, is cocaine, sold to parents with the same casualness as a bottle of cough syrup. The bottle itself is unremarkable, brown glass, a cork stopper, a label decorated with a smiling child or perhaps a cheerful little illustration of a tooth, because nothing sells a product to a worried parent quite like whimsy. This is the era of cocaine toothache drops, produced most famously by the Lloyd Manufacturing Company of Albany, New York, in the late 1880s, though similar products circulated on both sides of the Atlantic. And you can imagine the advertising copy, breezy and bright, promising an instantaneous cure, painless extraction of nerves that ache, a remedy so pleasant that children beg for another dose. Picture that phrase sitting on a shelf next to something for a scraped knee. That is the tone. Not a warning label in sight, just relentless, sunny reassurance. The 19th century equivalent of a pastel skincare ad aimed at 8-year-olds, promising glow and joy with an ingredient list nobody thought to question. Consider the actual moment in a household somewhere in London or Manchester or a small market town, a child crying through the night with a rotten tooth. Because dentistry in this century is not gentle, is not painless, and is often something closer to a blacksmith with better manners. A parent, exhausted, reaches for the little bottle, dabs a few drops onto a wad of cotton, presses it to the gum, and within moments the crying stops. Just like that. Because cocaine is, whatever else can be said about it, a genuinely effective local anaesthetic, and this is precisely why the drops worked, why parents bought them again and again, why word of mouth carried the product from one worried household to the next. It was not a hollow promise, it was a real one, propped up by a chemical nobody yet understood well enough to fear. It helps to understand just how bleak the wider landscape of dentistry actually was at this point, because the toothache drops were not competing against a modern dental surgery down the street. For most of the century, anyone could legally call themselves a dentist and set up shop, hang a painted sign, and start pulling teeth with whatever tools happened to be on hand, and it was not until the Dentists Act of 1878 that Britain made any serious attempt to regulate who was allowed to do this for money. Before that, tooth drawing was as often performed at a country fair by a travelling showman, sometimes accompanied by a drummer to muffle the screams and draw a crowd, as it was performed by anyone with formal training. The instruments of choice, a hooked device called a pelican and later a claw-shaped key, were used with more enthusiasm than precision, and anaesthesia, when it existed at all, meant a swig of brandy rather than anything resembling modern sedation. Ether and chloroform became available for dental work by the 1840s and 50s, and nitrous oxide followed not long after, but both cost money that a labouring family did not reliably have, which meant that a bottle of cocaine drops purchased for a few pence looked, by comparison, like an act of genuine mercy. What is missing entirely from this scene is any concept that would strike a modern parent as basic common sense. There is no dosing chart based on the weight of a child, there is no warning about a growing nervous system, no distinction drawn between what might be tolerable for a grown man and what might be poured into the mouth of a toddler. Nobody at the Lloyd Manufacturing Company is thinking about long-term neurological development, because the entire concept of long-term neurological development as something a company might be liable for damaging simply does not exist yet. There is no regulatory body checking any of this, no agency demanding proof of safety before a product reaches a shelf, no requirement that the bottle disclose anything beyond what the manufacturer felt like disclosing. If you want a fair modern comparison, imagine a wellness influencer selling a suspiciously effective throat spray with no ingredient panel, no clinical trial, and a return policy built entirely on good vibes, except that in this case, the throat spray genuinely works, which somehow makes it worse. And here is the part worth sitting with for a moment, because it would be easy to only laugh at this and move on. The parents buying these drops were not reckless. They were not careless or foolish by the standards of their own time. They were doing exactly what a loving parent does, which is reach for whatever relief is available, trust the people selling it, and choose their child not suffering over their child suffering. There was no alternative on offer, no gentler, better tested product waiting quietly in the wings that these parents were too lazy to seek out. This was the option. The full extent of paediatric medicine for toothache, for teething, for the long list of small miseries that visit every childhood, sat on a shelf next to sugar and starch, sold by a man in an apron who was every bit as unaware as the family standing in front of him. Other products crowded that same shelf. Cocaine dissolved into throat lozenges, worked into tonics and wines, marketed toward exhaustion, toward a sore throat, toward the general fatigue of simply being alive in a century without central heating. Toothache drops were not an outlier. They were part of a much wider and thoroughly cheerful culture in which a genuinely powerful stimulant drug sat within arm's reach of the flower and the tinned peaches, entirely legal, entirely unregulated, and entirely uncontroversial. Nobody clutched their pearls. Nobody wrote an outraged letter to the newspaper demanding the product be pulled. The outrage, when it eventually came, was still decades away, waiting patiently for the 20th century to arrive and start asking uncomfortable questions nobody in this room has thought to ask yet. Beyond the little brown bottle marketed directly at children, cocaine turned up in a whole catalogue of products aimed at their parents that ended up in the family medicine cabinet all the same. Angelo Mariani, a French chemist, blended coca leaf extract into Bordeaux wine and sold it across Europe and America as Vin Mariani, a tonic so respectable that it collected written endorsements from Pope Leo XIII, Thomas Edison and Sarah Bernhardt, each one praising its restorative effects with the enthusiasm of a modern celebrity unboxing a sponsor's protein powder. Across the Atlantic, a pharmacist in Atlanta named John Pemberton began selling his own coca leaf tonic in 1886 under the name Coca-Cola, marketed initially as a temperance drink and headache remedy for the whole family. Cocaine also found its way into powders and inhalers sold for catarrh and hay fever, snorted rather than swallowed, and into lozenges marketed towards singers, actors, and clergymen hoping to soothe a strained throat before a big performance, which meant that a child with a sore throat and a child with a rotten tooth were, statistically speaking, being treated with the very same drug from two entirely different shelves. None of this sat under any meaningful legal restriction. The Pharmacy Act of 1868, Britain's first serious attempt to control the sale of dangerous substances, placed a long list of poisons under restriction, arsenic among them, but cocaine was not considered dangerous enough to bother with, and it would remain freely available in Britain for another 5 decades, well past the point where the toothache drops and their cheerful smiling labels had become a distant, faintly embarrassing memory. So picture the bottle one more time, sitting there on its little shelf, label bright, promise cheerful, a smiling child painted somewhere on the packaging, utterly untroubled by the future. Somewhere in a nearby house, a toddler drifts off to sleep, gum-numb, crying finally stopped, and a relieved parent blows out the candle, congratulating themselves on having found, at long last, something that actually works. They were right about that much. It did work. That was always the problem. In a fashionable London flat, a brilliant, restless man reaches for a small case, and inside it is a syringe and a bottle, and he is about to inject himself with a 7% solution purely because the city has been too quiet and his brain cannot bear the silence. This is not a villain, not a cautionary tale limping through the margins of a Victorian melodrama. This is the hero. This is the most famous detective in the English language, created by a man who was himself a trained physician, and the injection is not treated by the author as a dark secret to be whispered about in shame. It is simply a habit, mentioned early and often, the same way another writer might mention that a character smokes a pipe or drinks too much tea. Arthur Conan Doyle sat down and wrote a scene in which his genius investigator rolls up his sleeve 3 times a day out of sheer boredom, and readers turned the page without so much as a raised eyebrow. Consider the object itself for a moment, that little case with its precise instruments, because the hypodermic syringe is, at this point in the story, still something of a novelty. The technique of injecting a solution directly beneath the skin had only really been developed and refined a few decades earlier, in the 1850s, largely through the work of a Scottish physician experimenting with ways to deliver pain relief directly and swiftly into the body. By the time a fictional detective is filling that syringe in his sitting room, the device is modern, faintly glamorous, a genuine piece of contemporary medical technology, the sort of thing an early adopter might have felt slightly proud to own, not unlike the first person on the street with a smartphone, except that this particular piece of technology delivers a 7% cocaine solution directly into the bloodstream, rather than a weather app. That Scottish physician was Alexander Wood of Edinburgh, who in 1853 began experimenting with injecting morphine near the site of a patient nerve pain. And around the same period a French surgeon named Charles Prevaz was independently developing a strikingly similar device on the continent. What began as a fairly narrow tool for treating neuralgia spread with remarkable speed once doctors realised how quickly and completely an injected drug could take hold compared to anything swallowed. The American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War, both fought within the following 2 decades, saw the syringe pressed into service on a massive scale to treat wounded soldiers with morphine, and the grim result was a generation of veterans who came home with a dependency so common that American doctors took to calling it soldier disease, an early and largely unremarked upon preview of exactly the kind of habit a certain fictional detective would later be found indulging in his own sitting room, minus the battlefield, and minus, for quite a while, any of the concern. What makes this detail so striking is not that a fictional character used cocaine. It is how little anyone in the story, or reading the story, treated this as remarkable. There was no gasp from the reading public, no petition, no wave of concerned letters to the publisher demanding the habit be written out. A hero who periodically injects himself with a stimulant purely to stave off the crushing tedium of a mind with nothing to solve was, for readers of this era, simply a hero with a quirk, filed somewhere between a taste for violin playing and an unusual talent for disguise. Imagine, for a moment, a beloved streaming detective today casually shooting up between cases because the city had gone quiet and his brilliant mind could not tolerate an ordinary afternoon. The internet would not recover for a week. Here it barely registered as a plot point worth lingering on. The detail appears right at the opening of the second novel in the series, published in 1890, where the detective is shown filling the syringe as a matter of daily routine, while his companion looks on with visible discomfort, quietly counting up how many months this has been going on. It is worth noting that this same decade also produced a genuine, legitimate medical breakthrough involving the very same drug, when a young Viennese ophthalmologist named Carl Koller discovered in 1884 that cocaine could be used to numb the eye completely for surgery, a discovery that transformed eye operations almost overnight and made cocaine, for a brief shining moment, one of the most celebrated substances in all of modern medicine. The detective was not indulging in some disreputable back-alley vice. He was using, recreationally and without much self-control, a drug that respectable surgeons across Europe were simultaneously hailing as a miracle. And yet there is one voice in the story pushing gently against all of this, and it belongs to the detective's loyal companion and roommate, a doctor by training, who watches the ritual with the syringe and does not approve. He raises the matter directly, questions the wisdom of it, worries aloud about what such a habit might be doing to a magnificent mind over time, and receives in return a bored, faintly superior explanation about how the drug sharpens thought and clears the mental fog of inactivity. This small disagreement, tucked into the story almost as a character beat rather than a moral crusade, is worth pausing on, because it is one of the earliest fictional hints of an attitude that had not yet caught up with the rest of the culture. The companion is not scandalised in the way a modern reader would be. He is concerned the way you might be concerned about a friend who drinks too much coffee and does not sleep. But he is concerned, and that quiet unease, arriving from a trained medical man, was a small crack in an otherwise untroubled surface, a sign of a shift still years away from becoming a consensus. It helps to remember that the author behind all of this had walked hospital wards himself, had studied medicine at Edinburgh, had almost certainly seen cocaine used and discussed in serious clinical settings where it was still considered, by respectable doctors, a promising and even fashionable tool. Sigmund Freud, working on the European continent around this same period, was writing enthusiastically about the drug as a treatment for fatigue and low spirits, in terms that would not be entirely out of place on a modern biohacking forum. Doyle was not inventing a scandal. He was reflecting, with a novelist's instinct for character, what a certain kind of clever, overeducated, chronically understimulated man of his class might reasonably reach for when the world failed to give him a puzzle worth his attention. Notably, by the time Doyle returned to the character more than a decade later, medical opinion on the drug had curdled considerably, and Watson is found reporting, with evident relief, that he had gradually weaned his friend off the habit entirely. A quiet piece of housekeeping that tracks almost exactly with how the wider culture's affection for cocaine soured across the same years. By the 1880s, the syringe itself had drifted well beyond the hospital ward and into fashionable private life, sold in velvet-lined cases through respectable department stores and pharmacy catalogues, marketed to the sort of middle-class household that might also have owned a good pocket watch or a set of monogrammed cufflinks. Owning one carried a faint whiff of modernity, proof that a person kept up with the latest advances in medical science, not unlike owning an early telephone or a bicycle with a newfangled pneumatic tyre. That a fictional detective should keep his own case tucked neatly on the mantelpiece, ready at a moment's restless notice, was therefore not even slightly implausible to a contemporary reader. It was, if anything, a small mark of his modernity, one gadget among the many that made him seem so thoroughly of his moment. So there he sits, sleeve rolled, syringe in hand, waiting for the solution to do what a locked room mystery cannot currently do for him. And somewhere across the room his friend frowns, says his piece, and gets exactly the reaction you would expect from a genius who has never once in his life enjoyed being told what to do. The case gets solved eventually. The habit does not. Down at the music hall, the gaslights are up, the crowd is roaring, and half the audience arrived already glowing thanks to a chemist shop 2 streets over, because nothing improves a mediocre comic singer quite like a strong dose of something recreational. The room itself is a genuine assault on the senses in the friendliest possible way, gas jets hissing along the walls and throwing a warm, slightly unsteady light across a sea of packed bodies, the air thick with tobacco smoke, spilled beer, and the particular sweetish smell of a crowd that has been standing shoulder to shoulder for several hours and has stopped apologising for it. Sawdust crunches underfoot. A brass band somewhere near the stage is playing something loud and slightly out of tune, and nobody minds. because tune was never really the point. This is Victorian entertainment at its most democratic and its most unfiltered. A night out built for working people and shopkeepers and clerks who have spent all week hunched over ledgers or standing behind counters, and now, finally, get to shout at a stage. The music hall is not a place of quiet reflection. It is loud by design, a place where the audience is expected to sing along, heckle, stamp their feet, and generally participate in a way that would get you removed from a modern theatre within minutes. The comic singer works the crowd with well-worn jokes and a wink. A woman in a spangled dress belts out a sentimental ballad about a sailor who never came home. And between acts, drinks keep arriving, because the music hall and the pub have never been terribly far apart, often sharing walls, sometimes sharing a single room entirely. Take the Canterbury Hall down in Lambeth as your model for the whole phenomenon, since it is generally credited as the very first purpose-built music hall, opened in 1852 by an enterprising publican named Charles Morton, a man later remembered with more than a little affection as the father of the halls. Before Morton, this kind of entertainment happened in cramped song and supper rooms attached to taverns. The Canterbury was something grander, a proper hall with a raised platform, a picture gallery hung with paintings for patrons to admire during the interval, gilt trim catching the gaslight, and rows of tables where a working man could sit with his pint and his pipe and watch the show without having to stand for 3 hours. Presiding over the whole evening from a table near the stage sat the chairman, gavel in hand, banging it down to announce each act with a flourish and, more usefully, to restore some semblance of order whenever the crowd's enthusiasm for a song threatened to turn into an actual brawl. And threaded through all of that beer is something else, something quieter and less visible than a pint glass, but every bit as present. Laudanum rides along in waistcoat pockets and small vials tucked into a lady handbag, a few drops added to a glass without much ceremony, taken the way someone today might tip a flask of something stronger into a paper cup at a concert. It was cheap. It was legal. It was sold 2 streets over by a chemist who would hand it across the counter with roughly the enthusiasm of a shopkeeper selling stamps. And for a tired worker looking to take the edge off a long week, it did the job admirably, if somewhat more thoroughly than intended. Between the gin, the laudanum, and the sheer volume of the crowd, the music hall on a Saturday night was less a performance venue than a fully immersive sensory experience, not unlike arriving at a modern arena show already 3 drinks in, except here the drinks might also include a mild opiate, and the merchandise stand sells cough remedies with kick. The gin itself deserves a word, because by this point in the century it was no longer being drunk out of desperation in back-alley dens the way it had been during the notorious gin craze of the previous century, but rather poured out over polished mahogany counters in what came to be called gin palaces, glittering, gaslit shop fronts fitted with engraved glass, brass rails, and mirrors specifically designed to make a cheap spirit feel like an occasion. Charles Dickens himself wrote about these places, noting with some irony how the poorest streets in London produced the most dazzlingly lit shop fronts, all that glamour wrapped around a drink so inexpensive and so strong that it had earned the nickname Mother's Ruin decades earlier and had never quite managed to shake it. A quartern of gin, a quarter pint, cost only a few pence, which meant that between the show on stage and the gin at the bar, a working family could manage an entire night of spectacle for less than the price of a proper dinner. Further back from the tables, past the chairman's watchful table and his gavel, ran a long promenade bar where the crowd thinned into something looser. A stretch of carpet where a different kind of transaction sometimes got conducted alongside the drinking, and where moral reformers of the day fixed their most anxious newspaper columns, wringing their hands over the mixing of perfectly respectable shopkeepers with company their vicars would not have approved of, all under one cheerfully indifferent gaslit roof. The halls operated for decades in a curious legal limbo, licensed not as proper theatres under the older Georgian-era Theatres Act, but as places of music and refreshment, a technical distinction that let them serve drink freely and sidestep the stiffer restrictions imposed on the legitimate stage, at least until licensing reforms in the 1870s began, very gradually, tidying the whole arrangement up. It also meant that a night at the Canterbury or one of its many imitators felt closer to a raucous private party than to anything resembling formal theatre, which was, of course, precisely the appeal. Picture the comic singer on stage, sweating slightly under the gaslight, working through a routine that has not changed in months, leaning on the same 3 jokes about mothers-in-law and unpaid rent. On a sober night, in a sober room, this might land as merely adequate. Tonight it lands as the funniest thing anyone in the building has ever witnessed, because the crowd has been thoroughly and cheerfully softened around the edges, laughing not entirely at the joke itself, but at the general glorious fact of being warm, loud, slightly drunk, and surrounded by several hundred people who feel exactly the same way. He could recite a grocery list up there and get a standing ovation. Nobody in that room is in a state to notice the difference, and frankly, nobody wants to be. There is a wonderful, chaotic democracy to the whole scene, a room where the aristocracy would never dream of setting foot, and the truly desperate poor could rarely afford a ticket, leaving a boisterous middle ground of butchers and seamstresses and dockworkers, all packed in together, all shouting the chorus of the same sentimental song at the top of their lungs. Half of them glassy-eyed from one substance or another, none of them particularly bothered by that fact. The evening rolls on past midnight, the band plays louder as the hour grows later, the smoke grows thicker, somebody near the back starts a fight over nothing in particular, and is cheerfully ejected by a doorman who has seen this exact fight roughly 400 times before. And somewhere in that crush of noise and gaslight and gin, a chemist across town is quietly closing up shop for the night, having sold, without a flicker of concern, most of what made the evening possible in the first place. He sleeps very well. He has earned it. Behind a high brick wall, life inside the workhouse is grim in ways that need no exaggeration, and for the poor souls unlucky enough to be outside its walls but not much better off, gin and the cheapest laudanum on the market are doing quietly desperate work. Inside those walls, families are separated on arrival, husbands from wives, parents from children. Everyone sorted into wards and set to hard, repetitive, deliberately unpleasant labour, because the whole system was designed on the theory that relief should be just uncomfortable enough to discourage anyone from wanting it. Outside those walls, things were not obviously better, only differently bad, a precarious existence built on seasonal farm labour, unreliable wages, and a landscape of illness that modern medicine had barely begun to name, let alone treat. The entire arrangement traced back to the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which enshrined a principle the men who drafted it called less eligibility, meaning, in the flattest possible terms, that conditions inside a workhouse had to be made worse than the situation of the very worst paid labourer surviving outside its walls, so that nobody would ever be tempted to choose it over honest poverty. This was not an accidental byproduct of a poorly designed system. It was the entire design. Inmates wore a uniform stripped of any hint of individual identity, ate meals in silence off a monotonous rotation of gruel and bread, and were set to labour that served no purpose beyond the labour itself, picking apart old tar-soaked rope fibre by fibre in a process called oakum picking until fingers cracked and bled, or breaking stone into gravel behind bars that made the whole operation look, to any passing observer, rather a lot like a prison that had simply forgotten to call itself one. Even the destitute traveller passing through for a single night, housed in what was called a casual ward and known to those who used it as the spike, was expected to perform a set task, usually stone breaking, before being allowed the next meal or a bed. Nowhere tells this story more plainly than the Fens, that flat, waterlogged stretch of eastern England spreading across Cambridgeshire, Lincolnshire and Norfolk, where the drained marshland bred a persistent, exhausting fever that locals simply called the ag. a malarial-style illness that settled into the bones of entire farming communities and refused to leave. Faced with a chronic illness that no doctor within reach could meaningfully treat, and precious little money for doctors in the first place, agricultural labourers in the fens turned to something that was, quite genuinely, cheaper and more accessible than almost anything else available to them, which was opium. Poppy heads could be bought from the local grocer alongside the tea and the candles, steeped into a bitter poppy head tea, or opium could be purchased in small penny pills from the same general store that sold flour, no different in the eyes of the shopkeeper than buying a bag of sugar. Contemporary observers of the time wrote about this with a kind of bemused alarm, noting that opium sat on shelves next to groceries in a way that would strike a modern visitor as somewhere between deeply strange and completely unremarkable, depending entirely on how tired you happened to be that week. Doctors who actually practiced in the fens during this period left behind a small but vivid body of reports on just how ordinary the habit had become, describing rows of poppy heads hanging to dry from cottage windowsills like laundry, and chemists in market towns such as Ely, Wisbech and King's Lynn moving through opium in quantities that per head of population dwarfed consumption almost anywhere else in England. Labourers were said to take a pill before setting out for the fields in the morning, much the way a modern worker might reach for a strong cup of coffee before a shift. A small ritual of preparation rather than a moment of crisis. Physicians writing to medical journals of the period described patients who had built up such a tolerance that doses which would have felled an unfamiliar user passed through them with barely a change in demeanour, and noted, with the clinical detachment of men still decades away from any real understanding of dependency, that these same labourers grew visibly uneasy and unwell whenever the supply ran short, a pattern they observed without yet possessing the vocabulary to properly name it. The workhouses built to receive anyone who could no longer manage outside them were, quite deliberately, unwelcoming from the outside in. Thousands of them raised across England and Wales in the years following the 1834 reform, many following a cross-shaped or courtyard layout borrowed more from prison design than from anything resembling a hospital or a home. High walls. Small windows, separate entrances for men and women so that a husband and wife arriving together might not see one another again, except by careful arrangement. The weekly diet inside was set out in official tables down to the ounce, a monotonous rotation of bread, gruel, potatoes, and the occasional scrap of cheese or meat, calculated with a bureaucrat's precision to keep an inmate alive and working without ever approaching anything a free labour outside might call a proper meal. Children admitted alongside their parents were frequently set to the same oakum picking and laundry work as the adults, given a bare minimum of schooling squeezed in around the labour, on the theory that idle hands, even small ones, were a luxury the parish could not be expected to fund. This was not recreational indulgence in any meaningful sense. It was, more often than not, the only healthcare on offer. There was no doctor riding out to a labourer cottage at the edge of a drained fen to treat a fever, no clinic, no district nurse, nothing resembling what a modern person would recognise as a medical safety net. What existed instead was a grocer with a jar of opium pills and a working knowledge of the dose that would settle a shivering, feverish adult, or, more troublingly, quiet a fretful infant, so that an exhausted mother could get back into the fields for the harvest. Babies were given tiny doses of laudanum or opium preparations to keep them still and silent while parents worked. Not out of neglect, but out of sheer practical necessity, because a farm labourer who could not work did not eat, and a screaming infant left unattended in a cottage was, in the calculus of grinding poverty, a worse outcome than a sedated one. None of this made for a comfortable arrangement. It made for the only arrangement available. There is a genuine, unglamorous cruelty sitting underneath all of this, and it deserves to be named plainly rather than dressed up in cheerful period detail, because the truth is that self-medication with opium and cheap gin was, for enormous stretches of the Victorian poor, simply what healthcare looked like. There was no safety net waiting to catch anyone. There was a workhouse designed to be worse than starvation, and just outside its gates, a grocer selling the closest thing to relief that money could buy, which in some parts of the Fens turned out to be genuinely cheaper than a proper dinner. When your options are an empty stomach, a bottle of gin, or a penny pill that at least makes the fever bearable for an afternoon, the choice stops being a moral failing and starts looking like simple arithmetic. And yet, even here in one of the bleaker corners of this story, there is something almost darkly comic about the sheer casualness of it all. The poppy heads sitting on the grocer's shelf between the candles and the cheese, priced without any particular ceremony. Sold to farmhands the way a modern corner shop sells energy drinks to someone pulling an all-night shift. Nobody in that shop is thinking about addiction, about withdrawal, about the long-term toll on a body already worn down by fever and fieldwork. They are thinking about getting through Tuesday. Somehow, against every odd, a fair number of them did. In the market square, a man in a loud waistcoat is standing on the back of a wagon, selling a miracle tonic that cures everything from consumption to a broken heart. And the secret ingredient, as with most things this century, is opium, dressed up in a very confident label. He has drawn a decent crowd already, farmers and shopkeepers and curious children drifting over from the stalls selling turnips and second-hand boots, pulled in by the sheer theatrical confidence of the man addressing them from his makeshift stage. His voice carries across the square without any strain, the practiced projection of someone who has delivered this exact speech in perhaps 40 other market squares this year alone, in towns that have never heard of him before, and in most cases will conveniently never see him again. The pitch itself is a marvel of ambition, promising relief for consumption, for nerves, for female complaints, for the vague melancholy of a disappointed heart, all from the same brown bottle held aloft for the crowd to admire. Somewhere near the front, a man steps forward to declare, with theatrical emotion, that this very tonic saved his life not 6 months earlier. And if you find yourself wondering whether that man might be an employee planted in the crowd for exactly this purpose, you are not the first person to have that thought, only about a century and a half too late to do anything useful with it. There is music sometimes, a fiddle or a drum to draw people in, and always the bottle itself held high, catching the light, promised as the very last one available today, a scarcity tactic that has survived essentially unchanged into the modern infomercial. What makes the whole spectacle work is not cleverness so much as total absence of anyone standing in the way. There is no agency checking whether the tonic actually treats consumption. There is no requirement to list ingredients on the label, no truth in advertising standard a disappointed customer could appeal to, no authority a sceptical bystander could report this man to, beyond perhaps the local constable, who has generally seen enough of these wagons pass through to have stopped caring. The products sold this way were not fringe curiosities either. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed cheerfully for teething babies and, in practice, consumed by plenty of tired adults as well, contained morphine in quantities that would startle a modern parent into calling an ambulance. Godfrey's cordial did similar work for infants across the country. Dalby's carminative promised to settle a fussy stomach with a similar opium base tucked quietly inside, and towering over most of them in sheer popularity was Dr. Collis Brown's chlorodyne, a combination of morphine, chloroform, and a healthy dose of cannabis extract. Marketed as a cure for cholera, diarrhea, coughs, neuralgia, and more or less anything else a customer cared to name, sold in respectable chemist shops right alongside the soap and the shaving brushes. The shelf behind the counter held plenty of company for those. Daffy's Elixir, a laxative tonic whose recipe stretched back well over a century and was still being sold under the same name, promised to purge and revive in a single dose. Turlington's Balsam of Life came bottled in a distinctively bulbous, oddly shaped bottle, whose sole purpose was to make counterfeiting more difficult, a 19th century answer to a tamper-proof seal. Thomas Holloway built an entire fortune, and eventually funded a university college that still bears his name on the strength of his pills and ointment, cure all sold with no more scientific basis than the Wagon Man's tonic, but backed by an advertising budget so enormous that Holloway is remembered today less as a healer than as one of the founding fathers of modern mass advertising. Thomas Beecham, not to be outdone, sold his own laxative pills under the slogan that they were worth a guinea a box, a phrase repeated so often in newspapers and on hoardings across the country that it outlived the man, the company, and very nearly the century itself. None of this required the theatrical wagon and the loud waistcoat. That particular showman on his makeshift stage was simply the most visible, most performative end of a much larger and thoroughly respectable industry, one that stocked pharmacy shelves in every city as confidently as it filled the pockets of travelling salesmen working the market circuit. The Wagon Man sells his tonic with a fiddle and a planted testimonial. The chemist down the street sells essentially the same promise with a tidy label and a calm professional voice, and somehow the calm professional voice was considered the more trustworthy delivery method, which tells you rather a lot about how little the actual contents of the bottle mattered to anyone making the purchase. The showman on the wagon belonged to a much older tradition too, the market patter seller sometimes known in Britain as a cheapjack, a rapid talking peddler of dubious wares who had been working fairs and market days with more or less the identical routine for generations before opium tonics ever entered the picture, and who would, within a few decades, find an American cousin in the travelling medicine show, complete with a small stage, a bit of music, sometimes even a minstrel act, all built around the same core transaction of entertainment first and product second. Testimonials from grateful customers, real or invented, were reliably printed in almanacs handed out for free. Cheerful little booklets stuffed with weather predictions and planting advice that also happened to carry, on nearly every other page, another glowing account of a miracle recovery attributed to whichever tonic had paid for the printing. Fairs themselves were natural hunting ground for exactly this kind of trade, since the same crowds who gathered at events like the Nottingham Goose Fair or the Old Bartholomew Fair in London arrived already primed for spectacle by fire-eaters, strongmen, dancing bears, and two-headed curiosities of questionable authenticity, which meant a quack doctor and his wagon simply took a comfortable place in a line-up of entertainments where nobody was in the habit of asking searching questions about credentials. Further respectable competitors filled out the rest of the market. Warner's Safe Cure arrived from America promising to remedy kidney complaints with a formula it declined to specify. Clark's world-famous blood mixture claimed to purify the blood of practically any impurity a customer cared to describe, sold in a bottle wrapped in testimonials from the supposedly cured. Between the wagon in the market square and the chemist counter in the city, the entire spectrum of Victorian commerce, from the lowest travelling patter merchant to the wealthiest self-made pill baron, ran on the exact same basic promise, delivered with varying degrees of polish but remarkably similar confidence. If you want the closest modern equivalent, picture an infomercial from decades past crossed with a present-day social media advertisement for a supplement that promises to fix your sleep, your joints, your mood, and your marriage using one mysterious proprietary blend that nobody involved can quite explain under direct questioning. The Victorian version had the added advantage of the tonic actually containing something pharmacologically active, which meant that, unlike a great many modern miracle cures, it did in fact make you feel something, usually within about 20 minutes, usually followed by a nap. Back in the market square, the wagon man is packing away his bottles as the light starts to fade, counting the day earnings with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has just convinced an entire town that opium dissolved in alcohol and flavoured with cinnamon represents the cutting edge of modern medicine. In roughly one sense, for this particular century, he was not even wrong. Somewhere in the empire, the soldier is handed his daily rum ration, along with a small measure of something stronger for pain, fatigue, or general morale, because an empire this large does not run on tea and good posture alone. Maybe he is in the Punjab, maybe he is somewhere along the Nile, maybe he is simply standing in a garrison town so far from Surrey that the word homesick has stopped meaning anything useful. Either way, the ritual is the same. The rum comes first, thick and dark, and issued with the brisk indifference of a man handing out spoons. Then, if he is unlucky enough to need it, which in this climate and this century is most of the time, comes the laudanum, dropped onto sugar or stirred into water. Because dysentery does not care about regimental pride, and neither does a bullet wound 3 days from the nearest surgeon. If you want specifics, consider West Africa, a posting so notorious for fever that soldiers and administrators alike simply called it the white man's grave. A nickname earned honestly by mortality rates that could exceed 1 in 10 men in a single deployment, mostly to malaria and yellow fever rather than enemy action. Or consider the Crimea a few decades earlier, where more British soldiers died of cholera, dysentery and exposure in the hospitals at Scutari than died of Russian bullets, a statistic that did more to launch Florence Nightingale's career than any single battle. In both cases the medicine chest looked much the same: quinine for the fever if you were fortunate enough to have any, and laudanum for absolutely everything else. Dispensed by exhausted orderlies who were themselves running on the same rum ration as the men they were treating. You would be forgiven for imagining Victorian soldiering as red coats and straight lines, and the occasional stirring bugle call, but spend 1 week in an actual campaign, and you would understand why half the British Army medical chest is, in practical terms, a very serious opium habit with a uniform on. Heat exhaustion, malaria, cholera, the general ambient misery of marching for days in wool clothing designed for a climate several thousand miles away, all of it gets treated the same way, with the same brown bottle that is currently doing overtime in every nursery, parlour and dockside pub back home. The army surgeon is not being reckless. He simply does not have anything else. Laudanum stops the pain, slows the bowels, which is no small mercy when dysentery is doing what dysentery does, and lets an exhausted man sleep sitting upright against a supply crate for 4 hours, which out here counts as a full night's rest. The rum itself deserves a word, since it is doing almost as much emotional labour as the laudanum. Issued daily under a tradition sailors and soldiers alike had inherited from the Royal Navy, it was thick, dark, overproof stuff, nicknamed by generations of drinkers as Nelson's blood after the rather grim, and largely apocryphal, story that the Admiral's body had been preserved in a cask of it on the voyage home from Trafalgar. True or not, the nickname tells you everything about how these men related to their ration, equal parts comfort, superstition and gallows humour, downed in a single practised motion before the real medicine, if it was needed, arrived a moment later. Think of it as the 1860s version of standard issue field kit, except instead of a multi-tool, it is a tincture that also, coincidentally, makes the whole unbearable situation feel about 40% more bearable, which is either a triumph of pharmacology or a very dark joke depending on how you look at it. And morale matters more than the regimental histories like to admit. A man who has not slept in 3 days because of gunfire, insects and existential dread is not a useful man. A man who has had a careful dose of laudanum and finally slept is at the very least upright and following orders again, which by the standards of 19th century warfare counts as combat readiness. It would be dishonest, in a story about small brown bottles and cheerful denial, to breeze past where a great deal of that opium is actually coming from. Much of it is grown, processed and shipped through British India, under a system the East India Company and later the Crown built quite deliberately, in which Indian farmers were pressured into cultivating poppies for a trade that made enormous profits in London and Calcutta, and which Britain, rather famously, went to war twice to keep flowing into China, whether China wanted it or not. That is not a footnote to tonight's story so much as the machinery underneath it, the reason the empire has this much opium lying around in the first place. Tonight is not the night for the full ledger of that history, but it deserves to be said once, plainly, before we move on, rather than skipped over as though the poppies simply appeared in the medicine chest by magic. The mechanics of that trade were nothing so simple as merchants buying whatever poppies happened to be available. The East India Company operated a formal opium monopoly out of Bengal, run through agencies at Patna and Benares, where company officers advanced cash loans to farmers each planting season. A system that sounds like generous credit until you notice the farmer had no real choice about accepting it, and no real say in the price paid for the raw gum once harvested. The processed opium was pressed into balls the size of cannonballs, wrapped in poppy trash casing, and shipped down to Calcutta to be weighed, graded and auctioned in a purpose-built factory that by mid-century was moving many thousands of chests a year. It was, in the driest possible administrative language, an extraordinarily efficient supply chain. It was also, less dryly, one of the largest state-run drug operations in human history, and the little brown bottle in the soldier's pack was simply where a small fraction of that enormous machine finally came to rest. Back at the garrison, none of this ledger is on anyone's mind, because the soldier holding his little dose has more immediate concerns, chiefly staying alive until Tuesday. The rum and the laudanum are handed out by men who are, in their own limited way, doing their best with the tools available, in an era before anyone had worked out that a body could quietly come to depend on the very thing keeping it upright. Some soldiers take their dose and feel nothing more than relief. Others, over months and years of campaigning, develop what regimental doctors sometimes note with polite vagueness as a certain fondness for the tincture, a phrase doing an enormous amount of work for something we would now recognise instantly and treat with considerably more concern than a raised eyebrow in a ledger. Consider the sheer scale of what is being asked of these men. Garrisoned in climates their wool uniforms were never designed for, drinking water that is frequently the very thing making them sick, marching distances that would today require a support vehicle and a hydration plan, and doing all of it while occasionally being shot at. Of course there is a bottle involved. There was always going to be a bottle involved. The genuinely remarkable thing is that anyone expected otherwise, that anyone imagined a person could endure all of that on willpower and the occasional letter from home. And it is worth remembering that back in Britain, newspapers print stirring accounts of imperial heroism, all scarlet coats and stiff upper lips and glorious last stands, while saying almost nothing about the tin cup of rum and the careful drops of tincture that got most of these men through an ordinary Tuesday. The heroism, it turns out, was frequently chemically assisted, which somehow never makes it into the recruiting poster, perhaps understandably. Nothing rallies the youth of Surrey to enlist quite like the phrase "come see the world," and also possibly develop a lifelong laudanum dependency while doing so. So the soldier drinks his rum, takes his dose, and settles in for whatever the night has planned for him, comforted in the specific glassy way that only a 19th century medicine chest can comfort a person. He is, in this single moment, doing exactly what his mother is doing back in London with her own teaspoon before bed, what the baby down the street is having spooned into it by a well-meaning nurse, what half the empire seems to be doing at any given hour of the day. The sun never sets on the British Empire, the old saying goes, and judging by the state of its medicine chest. It never quite fully woke up either. In 1868, for the first time in this whole story, a piece of paper called the Pharmacy Act is signed, and for the very first time someone in government looks at all of this and says, perhaps, just perhaps, we should write some of it down. Not stop it, not even particularly slow it down, just write it down, on a list, with a signature required, as though the entire preceding half-century of unrestricted opium sales had been less a public health situation and more a filing oversight that had simply gone unnoticed until now. Picture the scene in Parliament, if you can bear to. decades of laudanum in every household cupboard, cocaine soon to arrive as an ingredient in tonics and toothache drops, arsenic quietly poisoning both rats and the occasional inconvenient spouse. And it takes until 1868 for anyone official to stand up and suggest that perhaps a chemist shop selling a substance capable of stopping a person's breathing entirely should require slightly more ceremony than selling a bag of flour. The Act does two genuinely significant things. Credit where due. It restricts the sale of opium and a specified list of other poisons to registered pharmacists. People who have actually trained for this, rather than the grocer, the barber, or the general store on the corner, who had previously been selling laudanum alongside candles and boot polish with equal enthusiasm. And it introduces the poison register, a physical book in which the pharmacist must record the sale, the purchaser's name, the purpose, and get a signature, turning what had been a completely anonymous transaction into something with at least a paper trail behind it. The road to that single signature had in fact been decades long. The Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain, founded back in 1841 to give chemists some professional standing, had been petitioning for exactly this kind of restriction since at least the 1850s, watching bill after bill die quietly in committee, usually killed off by the very grocers and general dealers who stood to lose the most from it. What finally tipped the argument was not outrage so much as arithmetic. The Registrar General's office had, for years, been quietly compiling mortality statistics, and by the 1860s those figures showed, in cold, undeniable print, just how many of England's infant deaths were being filed under accidental poisoning by opiate, a category nobody in Parliament could comfortably keep waving away once it was sitting in front of them in a table. Much of that earlier campaigning had been driven by a pharmacist named Jacob Bell, who spent the better part of 3 decades lobbying Parliament, founding the Pharmaceutical Journal, and generally making a personal crusade out of professionalising his trade, only to die in 1859, 9 years before the Act he had spent his career pushing for finally reached the statute book. It is the sort of detail that would feel too neatly tragic in a novel, a man building the entire staircase and never once getting to climb it, and yet there it sits in the parliamentary record, plain as anything. Part of what finally forced Parliament's hand, curiously, was not opium at all but arsenic, and specifically the Bradford sweets poisoning of 1858, in which a batch of peppermint humbugs was accidentally made using arsenic trioxide in place of a harmless filler powder, killing more than 20 people within days, many of them children, in a single town. The scandal ran in newspapers across the country for weeks, and it did more to shift public opinion on the general question of unregulated poison sales than a decade of polite lobbying had managed on its own. Opium rode into the Act on the coattails of a headline about boiled sweets, which tells you a great deal about which kinds of tragedy actually move legislation, and which kinds simply accumulate quietly in the mortality tables until someone finally notices. This sounds, to modern ears, like an almost comically low bar to clear. A signature. A book. The 19th century equivalent of asking someone to type "I agree" before continuing. And yet, understand what it is replacing. Before 1868, a child could be sent to any shop in Britain to buy laudanum for a fussy sibling, with no more scrutiny than if they had been buying a loaf of bread. Which, as previous evenings of this story have already established at some length, is precisely what was happening in kitchens up and down the country. The poison register does not stop that exact scenario from continuing, not really, but it does mean that somewhere, in a ledger with a spine and a smell of old ink, someone is now required to at least glance up and ask a question before handing over the bottle. It is not prevention, it is the introduction of a witness. The reaction, predictably, is mixed in a way that will feel extremely familiar to anyone who has watched an industry respond to even mild regulation in any century whatsoever. Grocers and general shopkeepers, who have spent decades quietly and profitably selling laudanum along with their other wares, are considerably less than thrilled to discover this particular revenue stream now belongs exclusively to men with pharmaceutical training and a shop sign that says chemist. Some complain loudly about government overreach into an honest man's shelf stock. Pharmacists themselves, on the other hand, largely welcome the act, for the entirely understandable reason that it hands them a legal monopoly on one of the more reliably profitable items in the entire retail trade. Nothing sharpens a professional body's enthusiasm for regulation, quite like that regulation, also functioning as a very tidy exclusivity clause. The general public, meanwhile, mostly shrugs. Laudanum is still available, it is still cheap, it is still sitting on the same shelves, just now behind a slightly more official counter, dispensed by a man in an apron who might ask your name before handing it over, and who absolutely will still hand it over. If you are hoping, on behalf of the 19th century, for a dramatic before and after, a clean line between reckless old Britain and cautious New Britain, this is not that. This is a country taking one small, hesitant step, glancing around to see if anyone objects too strenuously, and then, having satisfied itself that nobody has, deciding that further steps can wait. And wait they do. Remarkably, cocaine, which arrives in Britain as a fashionable tonic ingredient not long after this act is passed, sails through the following decades with essentially no restriction whatsoever, sold in wine, in throat lozenges, in nerve tonics, entirely legally, for a further several decades. The Pharmacy Act covers opium and a defined list of poisons. It does not anticipate cocaine, chloroform frolics, cannabis tincture, or most of the other substances currently circulating through polite society, largely because nobody drafting it in 1868 could have guessed quite how creative Victorian medicine cabinets were about to become. Regulation, it turns out, is always chasing the last crisis rather than the next one, a habit governments have never quite managed to shake since. It is worth holding this next to what came decades later, if only to see how far the road still stretched. Real restriction of opium and its derivatives as controlled substances, the kind requiring an actual medical prescription rather than merely a shopkeeper's signature, would not arrive in Britain until the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920. More than half a century after this evening's small ceremony in Parliament, and even that was prompted less by decades of accumulated domestic concern than by international pressure following the Hague Opium Convention and the shock of morphine and cocaine misuse among returning soldiers after the Great War. 52 years is a long time to spend on a single signature and a ledger book. It is roughly the distance between a rotary telephone and a smartphone, which puts into perspective just how unhurried this particular reform was willing to be. So treat 1868 not as an ending, but as an opening line, the first sentence of a conversation that will take Britain the better part of a century to finish having. A signature here, a ledger there, the faintest gesture toward the idea that perhaps not every substance capable of stopping a heart should be purchasable with the same ease as a postage stamp. It is progress, technically glacially slow, largely symbolic, riddled with loopholes progress, but progress all the same. The 19th century has finally noticed the problem. It will spend the rest of it deciding very slowly that noticing is not quite the same thing as doing anything about it. Not every part of tonight's story is funny and in a crowded lodging house. A woman paid to mind other people's infants is dosing them heavily to keep them quiet while she minds several at once. A practice that will, quietly and tragically, cost more lives than this era ever liked to admit. You should understand, before anything else, that most of what is called baby farming begins in ordinary need rather than cruelty. A working mother, often unmarried, often desperate, with no family nearby and a job she cannot afford to lose, pays a small weekly sum to a local woman who will look after her child during the hours she cannot. It is, in its intention, not so different from any child-minding arrangement in any century, including this one. It helps, too, to hold this against the wider backdrop of the era, Victorian Britain lost a substantial share of its infants before their first birthday under perfectly ordinary circumstances, to diseases and conditions that had nothing to do with any bottle on any shelf, in numbers that would be almost unthinkable to a modern parent. Grief of that particular kind was, in a sense that is hard to fully absorb now, a quiet, constant presence in ordinary life, rather than an exceptional event. That does not excuse what happened in the crowded lodging houses. It only means that the people living through it had, tragically, very little frame of reference for noticing when an already high number crept quietly higher still. But intention and outcome are two very different rooms, and in this particular room, the woman minding 4, 5, sometimes 6 infants at once in a single small set of lodgings with no help and no rest of her own, finds that a soothing syrup does something a spare pair of hands cannot. A few drops of Godfrey's cordial, a teaspoon of Mrs. Winslow's, and the crying stops. Not soothed, not settled, but stopped, the infant sliding into a heavy, opiate-laced sleep that can last for hours, freeing her to manage the rest of the household, the other children, the endless list of things one woman cannot possibly do with her arms already full. You already know from earlier tonight how casually these syrups sat on ordinary shelves, how completely unremarkable it was for any household to keep one within reach. What made the baby farm different was not the substance but the arithmetic, dose calculated not by a child's tiny weight, but by how much silence the day required, administered by women who were, more often than not, simply exhausted and trying to survive an impossible workload, rather than acting out of any deliberate unkindness. Some infants grew pale and listless and simply never woke properly from a nap. Some stopped feeding, the drug-suppressing appetite along with everything else, and wasted away over weeks in a manner doctors at the time were slow to connect to the bottle on the shelf. Coroners, when they were called at all, frequently recorded these deaths under vague headings, convulsions or teething, or simply debility, because the alternative explanation was one that implicated a substance sitting in nearly every home in the country, and admitting that was a harder thing to write down than a kinder, vaguer word. Doctors who studied the question at the time, working from the same mortality registers that tracked every other cause of death in the country, found something they could not easily explain away. Infants placed with paid minders dying at markedly higher rates in their first year than infants kept at home by their own mothers, even accounting for the poverty both groups shared. Nobody at the time had settled language for what they were seeing. They simply had a column of numbers that kept coming out wrong year after year, and a slowly growing unease about what that column meant. It took the accumulation of many such reports over many years for the pattern to become impossible to look past entirely. Public health officials and a handful of persistent doctors began, slowly, to note the correlation between soothing syrups and infant deaths in exactly the households where infants were being minded in bulk, for money, by women stretched far past what any one person could reasonably manage. The reporting was imperfect, and the reform slower still, moving at the same unhurried pace as so much else in this story. But the pattern was there for anyone willing to look at it honestly, in parish records and coroners' notes that quietly outnumbered anything the papers were willing to print in bold type. A parliamentary select committee finally examined the question in 1871, gathering testimony from doctors, coroners and clergy who had, each in their own parish, begun to notice the same quiet pattern. The result was the Infant Life Protection Act of 1872, a modest piece of legislation that required anyone caring for more than one infant under a year old in exchange for payment to register with a local authority and submit to occasional inspection. It was not a solution so much as an acknowledgement, the first time the state had formally recognised that a paid arrangement of this kind needed watching at all. Enforcement remained thin, inspectors were few, and the Act said nothing about what a woman minding 4 infants alone was actually meant to do instead. But it marked, however faintly, the beginning of official concern, where before there had been almost none. The 1872 Act, as modest as it was, did not end the concern, and further legislation followed a generation later, in 1897, tightening registration requirements and giving local authorities somewhat broader powers of inspection. Progress here, as in so much of this story, moved by inches rather than leaps, each small adjustment arriving only after enough quiet evidence had accumulated to make inaction harder to justify than action. It is not a triumphant arc. It is a slow one, built mostly out of parish registers, patient doctors, and the kind of institutional attention that took far longer to arrive than anyone living through it would have wished. It is worth sitting with the fact that these were not, by and large, monstrous women doing something they knew to be wrong. Most were poor themselves, doing a job nobody else wanted, in conditions nobody had designed with any care at all, using the only tool that was cheap, legal, and available to buy them a few hours of quiet in days that offered none. The tragedy sits less in any one person's choice, and more in a whole system, medical, social, and economic, that handed an overworked, underpaid woman an opiate as her primary tool for managing other people's children, and then expressed polite surprise, decades later, when that arrangement went exactly as badly as it was always going to. There is no punchline to reach for here, and reaching for one would be its own kind of unkindness. What there is instead is a small human image worth holding on to as the night moves forward, somewhere in that crowded lodging house. Alongside every quiet tragedy the records eventually admitted to, there were countless other evenings that ended differently. A tired woman rocking a child back to an ordinary undrugged sleep with nothing more than patience and a worn-out lullaby, doing the best she possibly could with almost nothing to work with. It is worth remembering both. The century that let this happen was not made of villains. It was made mostly of tired people, doing an impossible job with the only tools anyone had ever handed them. And it is that, more than anything else, that deserves to be carried quietly into whatever comes next tonight. In a laboratory in Germany, a chemist working for a promising young pharmaceutical company has just synthesized a new cough treatment he is convinced is safer than morphine, and he is about to name it after the German word for heroic, which, with the full benefit of hindsight, may not age well. The company is Bayer, not yet the aspirin giant of household familiarity, but already an ambitious dye and chemical concern, with a sharp eye for the pharmaceutical market, and the year is 1898. The chemist, a man named Heinrich Draser, working in Bayer's research division, has taken morphine and added 2 acetyl groups to it in a process called diacetylation, producing a compound that crosses into the brain faster and, in early testing, seems to suppress cough more effectively while, in his professional judgment, carrying none of morphine's troublesome habit-forming baggage. It helps to understand what kind of company was standing behind this decision. Bayer had begun life in 1863 in Barmen as a maker of synthetic aniline dyes, the kind of unglamorous industrial chemistry that made fortunes quietly rather than heroically, and it was only in the 1880s that the firm built a dedicated pharmaceutical research division, gambling that the same chemistry used to fix colour into fabric might also be turned toward fixing ailments in people. The gamble paid off almost immediately, and as it happens, almost simultaneously. In the very same laboratory, under the very same research director, a chemist named Felix Hoffmann had synthesized aspirin barely a year before Dresser turned his attention to diacetyl morphine, meaning Bayer launched 2 of the best-known drugs in pharmaceutical history within about 12 months of each other, one of which is still in your medicine cabinet, and one of which is not. You are entitled to picture him standing over the workbench feeling rather pleased with himself, because by every measure available to him at the time, he had every reason to be. Early trials, conducted mostly on hospital patients and Bayer's own staff, showed the new compound relieving severe coughs, easing the laboured breathing of tuberculosis and pneumonia patients, and doing so apparently, without the sedation and dependency that made doctors wary of morphine. Draser named it heroin, from the German heroisch, meaning heroic, a branding choice so confident it borders on a dare, the pharmaceutical equivalent of naming your startup definitely not a bubble. Bayer did not tiptoe into the market with this one. Heroin launched as an over-the-counter remedy, sold in tins and bottles with no prescription required, marketed specifically as a cough suppressant and, in one of the era's more remarkable pieces of advertising, as a treatment gentle enough for children. Picture the label, cheerful and confident in exactly the way patent medicine labels always are, recommending a dose for a child with a persistent cough the same way you might now read a bottle of cherry-flavoured syrup and reach for the little plastic measuring cup without a second thought. Bayer distributed samples to physicians across Europe and America, presenting heroin as the compassionate, modern alternative to morphine, a drug you could give a child, a drug you could give a grandmother with bronchitis, a drug that solved the exact problem morphine had been causing for decades, addiction, without, they were quite sure, causing any new problems of its own. The marketing itself was executed with the same thoroughness Bayer brought to its dye business. Sample tins and promotional literature went out by post to physicians across Europe, the Americas and Asia, printed in a dozen languages and accompanied by testimonial letters Bayer had specifically solicited from doctors willing to praise the new compound. Trade journals carried advertisements listing heroin alongside aspirin as twin flagship products sold in tablet, lozenge, elixir, and pastille form, marketed not as a niche prescription item, but as a general household remedy any pharmacy could stock and any family could keep on the shelf next to the cough drops. It was, in the coldly admirable language of modern marketing, a textbook global product launch, decades before anyone had coined the phrase, and it worked exactly as well as Bayer had hoped it would, right up until it worked rather better than anyone had hoped in a direction nobody had intended. Heroin, incidentally, was originally a registered trademark, not a generic term, protected by Bayer in exactly the same way aspirin was, complete with a capital letter and legal enforcement against competitors who tried to use the name for their own products. That trademark survived until the end of the First World War, when the Treaty of Versailles stripped Bayer of its patent and trademark rights in Britain, France, Russia, and the United States as part of war reparations, which is the slightly absurd historical footnote in which a brand name for what we would now call a hard narcotic ended up dissolving into generic use as a side effect of a peace treaty rather than any deliberate act of drug policy. By the time heroin and aspirin were both on the market, Bayer had effectively assembled a template that pharmaceutical companies are still following today. Patent the compound, brand it aggressively, court physicians directly rather than relying on word of mouth, and expand into as many national markets as quickly as possible before anyone asks too many follow-up questions. It worked spectacularly well for aspirin. It worked for a while exactly as well for heroin, which is precisely the problem. The company was not being uniquely reckless by the standards of its era. It was simply very good at its job, in a decade when nobody had yet built the guardrails to catch a company that good. It would take remarkably little time for that confidence to curdle. Within just a few years, doctors began reporting that patients given heroin for cough or pain were developing a tolerance and dependency that looked, on closer inspection, disturbingly similar to the morphine addiction it had been designed to replace, except arriving faster, and if anything, more severely, precisely because of how efficiently the compound crossed into the brain. The very feature that made it such an effective cough suppressant, that rapid onset, turned out to be the same feature making it so ferociously habit-forming. Bayer, to its credit or its considerable financial relief depending on how charitably you read it, would eventually stop marketing heroin as it became clear what it actually was, but not before it had been distributed across 2 continents as a safe household remedy, sold without prescription for the better part of 2 decades. Sit with the irony of it for a moment, because it deserves to be sat with. A drug created explicitly and sincerely to solve the addiction crisis caused by morphine went on to become one of the most fiercely addictive substances in recorded pharmaceutical history. Marketed the entire time under a name that means heroic, sold to treat the coughs of literal children, praised in medical journals as the compassionate choice. It is the 19th century's most spectacular own goal, a masterclass in confident branding meeting catastrophic long-term data, and it happened not through malice or fraud, but through the exact same optimistic, under-tested enthusiasm that gave us cocaine toothache drops and radium-adjacent tonics and everything else this show has spent its evenings cheerfully cataloguing. What makes it land differently from the toothache drops and the tonics, though, is the scale of what followed. This was not a niche remedy fading quietly into obscurity. This was a name that would go on to define an entire category of the modern drug crisis, a word that, within a single generation, would mean something entirely different to entirely different people. And none of it would have surprised the man standing at that workbench in 1898, less than it would have surprised him to learn how the story actually ended. He believed, with the complete sincerity of a chemist who trusted his own early trial data a little too much, that he had built something heroic. History, with its usual talent for irony, kept the name and quietly rewrote everything else about the sentence. As the gas lamps are lit and the house settles for the evening, the same brown bottle from this morning comes back out, because whatever else has happened today, the day still has to end the way it always ends, quietly, softly, and more than a little bit sedated. It has been, by any measure, a very full day. A tin of cocaine toothache drops in one household, a spoonful of cannabis tincture in another, a soldier somewhere in the Empire finishing his ration, a chemist in Germany certain he has just invented something heroic, a pharmacist somewhere quietly writing a name into a poison register for the very first time. All of it happening at once, all of it entirely unremarkable to the people living through it, all of it simply what a day was, in this particular century, in this particular country. And now it is evening, and the pattern closes exactly where it opened. The same hands that reached for the bottle at dawn reach for it again now, the ritual so familiar it barely registers as a decision at all. The way you do not decide to breathe, you simply do it, and have been doing it for so long that the alternative has stopped feeling like an option worth considering. A few drops in water, or a spoonful straight, the taste no longer even unpleasant after this many repetitions, just a flavour the evening comes wrapped in, the way your evenings might come wrapped in the particular blue light of a screen you are not quite ready to put down. There is a particular heaviness that comes over a body at this hour, quite apart from anything in the bottle. The ordinary heaviness of a day spent standing, carrying, minding, waiting, worrying. The small accumulated weight of simply having been a person since before sunrise. You know this heaviness yourself, even now, even here, the way your own shoulders have been slowly lowering since this story began, the way your breathing has already started to match its unhurried pace to the words, rather than the other way round. It is not a dramatic sensation. It rarely is. It arrives the way dusk arrives, so gradually that by the time you notice it has already mostly happened. Consider, for a moment, everything this single bottle has been asked to do across just one ordinary household's single ordinary day, and how little anyone in that household thought to remark on any of it. It steadied a nervous mother through a difficult morning. It quieted a teething infant through a difficult afternoon. It will now, in its final act of the day, ease a working body into sleep, the same way it has eased countless bodies into sleep every single night for decades, in townhouses and tenements alike, entirely without ceremony. There was no debate at breakfast about whether to take it. There will be no debate now. It is simply what the evening requires, the way a modern evening might require a locked door and a lowered thermostat, an unremarkable closing ritual performed by people who have never known an alternative. Somewhere across the Empire tonight, that same soldier from earlier is finally lying down too, his ration finished, his fever easing, the noise of the day fading into the particular hush that settles over a garrison after dark. Somewhere else the pharmacist has closed his ledger for the night, the fresh ink of the day's last signature already drying, the poison register resting closed on its shelf until morning. And somewhere in a crowded lodging house, a tired woman has finally settled the last of the children she minds, the room gone quiet in whatever way it manages to go quiet, and has allowed herself, at last, to sit down. Think, too, of everyone else this story has quietly introduced you to over the last several evenings, the fashionable hostess and her ether parties finally hanging up her evening gloves, the anxious young clerk setting down his tin of toothache drops for the night, the chemist behind his counter turning the sign in his window from open to closed. None of them know each other, none of them will ever meet. And yet tonight, at this exact hour, in this exact soft and heavy way, they are all doing more or less the same small human thing, letting go of a day that asked a great deal of them, and trusting that morning will still be there to pick the rest of it up. What is worth carrying with you, more than any single fact from tonight, is just how completely ordinary all of this felt while it was happening. Nobody in this story believed they were living through anything unusual. The mother with her cordial, the office worker with his cocaine wine, the fashionable hostess passing round the ether at her party, the soldier with his ration, the infant in the crowded lodging house, none of them thought of themselves as characters in a cautionary tale. They thought of themselves as people getting through an ordinary day using the ordinary tools available to them, the same as you do now, the same as anyone in any century has ever done. History rarely announces itself while it is happening. It simply feels like a Tuesday, and then, decades later, someone looks back and calls it something else entirely. Outside, the city is folding itself up for the night, in the unhurried way cities did before electric light taught them to stay awake past their bedtime. A lamplighter moves down the far end of the street with his long pole, dimming what he lit only a few hours before, the small orange halos winking out one after another like a slow, deliberate exhale. Inside, the fire has burned down to that low orange murmur that asks nothing of you, and the room smells faintly of coal smoke and wax, and the particular mustiness of old velvet curtains that have absorbed 100 other evenings exactly like this one. A church bell somewhere marks the hour, soft and a little muffled through glass and curtain, the kind of sound that barely interrupts anything at all, more felt than heard, the way a heartbeat is felt rather than heard. The blankets are heavier than they were an hour ago, or perhaps it is simply that you have stopped noticing their weight as a thing separate from your own. The two settled into each other the way they do at the very end of a long day. The gas lamps are dimming now, one by one, along the street outside, and inside the house the last small tasks of the evening are winding down with them. The bottle goes back onto its shelf, exactly where it always sits, exactly where it will sit again tomorrow morning when this whole quiet ritual begins once more. The fire settles into embers. The clocks tick a little slower than they did an hour ago, or perhaps that is simply how it starts to feel, this late, this warm, this heavy behind the eyes. Somewhere down the street, another lamp goes dark. Somewhere above you, the last cart of the evening rolls slowly home over cobblestones, its sound fading rather than stopping, the way most things at this hour fade rather than stop. The room grows quiet. The breathing in it grows slow and even. Whatever the day carried, it is being set down now, gently, the way a hand sets down something it has been holding for a long time. There is nowhere else to be. Nothing left that needs deciding. Just the dark settling in soft around the edges of the room, and the bottle back on its shelf, and the house, at last asleep. And that is where we leave Victorian Britain tonight, gaslit, medicated, and entirely convinced that everything is under control. What a strange, tender, occasionally alarming century it turns out to have been. A world that fainted at a bare ankle and yet sold morphine to children over the counter. A world that policed a woman's every word at the dinner table while quietly letting her keep a bottle of laudanum behind the good china. Because that particular secret, at least, was one everybody agreed not to mention. It is easy to laugh at all of it, and we have, gladly, all evening, because there is something genuinely funny about an empire this vast and this self-serious running, in large part on cocaine wine and cordial. But underneath the laughing there is something worth honouring too, in the sheer, quiet endurance of the people who lived through it. The mothers minding 6 children with nothing but exhaustion and a spoonful of syrup between them. The soldiers, the mill workers, the fen labourers, getting through days that asked more of a human body than a human body was ever built to give, using whatever the shelf had to offer. They were not reckless. They were not foolish. They were simply doing the best they could with what their century handed them, which is, in the end, all any of us are doing with ours. So if you are lying there now, warm, comfortable, in a room that is not full of coal smoke, drifting off without a brown bottle anywhere in reach, let that be tonight's quiet gift to you. Not a lesson, exactly, just a little perspective, carried gently into sleep. Rest well tonight. Let the modern world, with all its small comforts, hold you the way it was always meant to, and I will see you next time for another night, another century, another story to fall asleep to.